Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Became a Quirkless Vigilante? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Toshinori glanced down at the boy as rain fell down all around them. Yes, the boy definitely had a heroic spirit, but just being near the power of one of Toshinori's full-strength punches was enough to practically knock him out. If he were to have that power inside him that his body wouldn't be able to handle it, he'd break. Giving a weak body so much power would be irresponsible, no matter how strong his spirit was. Besides, Toshinori's power was running out. He needed a strong successor. The boy would be able to find other ways to help people. You're just a quirkless failure that wouldn't even cut it as a rent-a-cop, Deku. Kaken screamed. You didn't help me. You did nothing. I don't owe you anything. You got that? Izuku nodded fearfully as Kaken stalked off. He was right, Izuku really hadn't done anything except get in the way. But at least he tried. It had been weirdly exhilarating, that one moment of risking his life for someone else before giving up on his dreams forever. If you want to be a hero so bad, take a swan dive off the roof and pray you'll be born with a quirk in the next life. Izuku shook his head. No, Kaken was just being mean. Izuku didn't actually want to die, right? That's not why he'd run in to stop that villain. The rush was just because he'd deluded himself into thinking he was helping Kaken. And there were plenty of other ways to help people, just like All Might had said. He could become a policeman. You wouldn't even cut it as a rent-a-cop. No, it would probably be best to do some research when he got home. There had to be other people out there that realized they couldn't be heroes, right? Maybe he could do some digging online and find out what careers they went into? He walked into the apartment and was immediately almost knocked off his feet as his mom ran to hug him. Oh, Izuku, baby. I was so worried. What were you thinking? I guess I wasn't. Izuku chuckled. Sorry, Mom. After finally convincing his crying mother that he was, in fact, alive and well, he took a shower and then sat down with his laptop to look into alternate careers. The question now was what to type into the search engine. What to do when you can't be a hero. The search algorithm must be designed to search for any word in the entered phrase because the top results were all interview clips from various pro-heroes giving the anyone can be a hero speech. But halfway down the page, however, Izuku finally saw a result that looked halfway like what he was actually searching for. He clicked on the link and it took him to a thread on one of the hero forums. A user a few years ago had asked, I just took the exams for several different hero courses and didn't get in. Being a hero was all I ever wanted to do, so what should I do now that it isn't an option? Well, Izuku hadn't quite gotten to the point of actually taking the UA entrance exam, but the rest applied pretty well. He scrolled through the various answers. A lot of them just offered condolences and told the asker to talk to the career counselor at their school. Izuku didn't think that'd help him much though, considering that when he'd met with his school counselor last year, the woman had told him to consider being a garbage man. Not that that wasn't a completely valid career, but he knew she only suggested it because he was quirkless. Izuku wanted a job where he could actually help people. A few people suggested being a doctor, but Izuku didn't think he was smart enough for that. His classmates were always telling him that he was a stupid Deku, after all. Policeman might be a good option, but then again, Kaken was probably right. If he didn't have what it took to be a hero, why would he have what it took to be a cop? He was just about to close the browser and go to bed when a comment with a large thread caught his eye. Well, if you didn't get into the hero course, you can always be a vigilante. Most of the replies to that were exactly what Izuku suspected they'd be, basically bullying the commentator for suggesting something so obviously illegal. Izuku shouldn't even be thinking about this. He was in enough trouble for running into the situation earlier, but wait? Wasn't that vigilantism too? They probably let him off easily because he's a kid and it was obviously the first time he'd done something like that. But that thrill of almost dying to save someone else. Izuku opened another tab. It wouldn't hurt to do some more research on vigilantes, right? The more he learned, the more he'd understand that this was a completely stupid idea that he absolutely should not do. It was obviously stupidly dangerous and had a very good chance of killing him, right? There wasn't a whole lot of information on particular vigilantes, at least not as much as there was on the legal heroes. Heroism was often based on fame, but apparently most vigilantes didn't get very popular. But popularity wasn't very important to Izuku. He didn't really need to be popular to be happy. Fame was for people like Kaken who deserved it. Then, around midnight, Izuku read a research paper about a group a few years ago called the Myheadinthecoudsnotcomingdown Vigilantes. It was by a college student who apparently hadn't gone on to do any more serious research, but it did give a decent overview of vigilantism in general and how illegal heroes were seen by the general population. According to the Japanese government, vigilantism is defined as using one's quirk in an unauthorized act of heroism. The vigilantes of Myheadinthecoudsnotcomingdown definitely fit the bill, but do people see them as evil, like the government proclaims, or as good? Izuku read the first sentence a total of 5 times before looking up the actual law. At least according to the government, quirkless people couldn't technically be vigilantes. Wait, he couldn't be a vigilante. Izuku didn't end up getting any sleep that night, since by the time he'd finished reading all the various laws on self-defense and quirk usage, the sun was already rising. He should still probably find some way to conceal his identity, since he didn't want to make his mother worry, but there was no law preventing him from risking his life to help people. When Izuku arrived at school the next day, his classmates had already heard both about Kaken's invitation to jump off a roof and Izuku's idiotic run-in with the sludge villain, and they had apparently decided that the two must be related. The loser, there are easier ways to kill yourself. He was just being an attention hog. Can you imagine wanting to die on live TV? Izuku ignored them. He didn't want to kill himself. That was stupid and would break his mother's heart. Not to mention that if he killed himself, Kaken would get in trouble for suicide baiting him. There were a lot of reasons why the teachers didn't bother reporting Kaken for his more explosive tendencies, but one of them was that if Kaken's treatment of him were discovered, he might not be able to go to UA and Izuku wouldn't be able to live with himself if he was the reason Kaken didn't become a hero. Well, he wouldn't be living at all in that hypothetical situation, would he? Whatever, it was still the same concept. If he were to die doing vigilante stuff, on the other hand, Izuku shook his head. He really shouldn't be thinking about stuff like that. It wasn't normal. He sat down at his desk and sighed at the flower someone had put on it. Apparently, there had been some sort of unspoken barrier against telling Izuku to kill himself, but now that Kaken had blown that barrier up, the other students were more than happy to follow his lead. Izuku glanced over toward Kaken, who was very determinedly not looking at Izuku. No, Izuku should stop thinking everything was about him. Kaken just thought that the view out the window was much more interesting to look at than a worthless Deku like him, and he was right. Izuku grabbed the flower and went to throw it away amidst a chorus of giggles and whispers from his classmates. He could handle this. It really wasn't that much worse than it had been, and Izuku was used to insults and threats. Why should this new evolution be any different? Izuku had been wrong. Suicide baiting was different than what he'd been through before. A few days ago, he definitely suspected that most people would be happy if he died, but now he knew it. Was living even worth it anymore? Maybe it would be easier, but Izuku still couldn't be responsible for getting Kaken in trouble or making his mom feel guilty. He frowned as he started to walk home. Being quirkless SCD. Maybe he should go out and do some vigilante stuff later? When he'd researched it last night, he'd originally planned on waiting a few months to go out so he could get in shape and maybe get some fight training, but after the day he just had to, he wasn't going to go intentionally put himself in danger, he was just going out to get the lay of the land, right? He took a detour to a nearby shopping center on the way home, since he didn't really have anything appropriate to wear for technically legal crime fighting. His mom would be so worried if he somehow got a cold because he didn't dress warmly enough before going out all night, so he couldn't just wear one of his t-shirts. The problem was that all his jackets and hoodies were hero merch, not that there was anything wrong with wearing hero merch, but there'd been another vigilante, the Crawler, who wore an All Might hoodie. Izuku didn't want people thinking that he was the Crawler because what if that guy got in trouble for what he did? Besides, it wasn't very polite to steal someone else's signature look. He ended up buying a dark green hoodie. It was thick enough that it would keep him warm and the dark color would be good to help him blend into the shadows. Black would probably be better, but the store was out of black and he was left to choose between green or navy, so he figured he may as well match his hair. There was a costume store next door to the department store he'd bought the hoodie at, so he decided he'd walk around and see what he could find to hide his identity. After looking at probably way too many different kinds of masks, he groaned in frustration. The simplest option would be to choose a simple domino mask, but one good punch and it'd be flying off his face. Not to mention that it might slide around and impair his field of vision, which wouldn't be safe at all. He was about to leave when he walked past a display of different goggles. That might be useful if someone tried to throw dirt in his eyes or something, right? The only problem was that he'd be going out at night. The goggles would need to be tinted to hide his face, but then they'd darken his field of vision. Izuku frowned, then noticed a sticker on one of the brands. Quirk Enhanced, won't color your vision. That would work. Izuku tried on a pair and sure enough, even though he should be seeing everything in hot pink, the world looked completely normal. He shook his head a few times to see if they were secure. Alright, so the goggles weren't just going to fall off like a mask would. But did he really want them in pink? He ended up getting the goggles in dark green to match the hoodie and his hair. It was much simpler to have everything match rather than try to worry about accent colors and everything. And it's not like Izuku actually cared about what his vigilante alter ego looked like. He just wanted to help people. If he were going to be an actual hero, stuff like looks would be really important, but that he didn't think he even deserved to look like a hero. So, Izuku really didn't need his vigilante outfit to be anything special, he just needed it to be practical. The guy at the checkout had a unicorn quirk, which Izuku thought was pretty cool. Did he just have the horn or were there other aspects of his quirk? Could he run faster than the average person? How did the horn affect? Hey kid, are you actually gonna buy that, or are you just gonna stand there? Sorry. Izuku put the goggles down on the counter and the guy scanned them. Nice goggles, kid. You making a cosplay? Planning out his vigilante outfit was kinda like making a cosplay, right? Why yep. The cashier nodded. Cool. That's where most of our sales come from, you know? But, by the way, if you're going for Hawks, we do have yellow goggles in the same brand. No thank you. It's, for something else. The guy shrugged. Gotta admit, I don't know all the heroes, but good luck with your cosplay. Hope it turns out okay. Izuku nodded. Thank you. Have a nice day. When Izuku got home, he hid the bags in the back of his closet and got to work on his homework, which was deceptively easy as usual. He always got through it too quickly, so he had to go back and second-guess all his answers because his classmates, even Kaken, took twice as long and there's no way Izuku was smarter than them. So, yeah, doing his homework didn't make him any less stressed. Mom called him for dinner right as he finally finished. She kept glancing at him between bites like she was trying to check if he was okay. He didn't know why she was so worried. He hadn't had any negative effects from the villain attack last night, and it wasn't likely he was going to be affected by it now. And Mom couldn't be worried about the bullying because she thought it was a thing of the past. When Izuku was 9, he'd realized that the only one he was hurting by reporting his classmates was himself because he'd get detention for being a troublemaker, so he'd told Mom that it had stopped and had taken up first aid as a hobby. So if it wasn't the villain attack and it wasn't the bullying, what was she so worried about? You're quiet tonight, Izuku. Mom said finally. Is everything okay? Oh, so she was worried because he wasn't talking, that made sense. But he couldn't tell her about the vigilante thing, she'd be so worried. Yeah, Mom, all good. He smiled. It was just a long day at school, so I'm pretty tired. Mom frowned. Those teachers aren't overworking you, are they? No. They're just trying to get us ready for high school and you know how much work that takes. Oh, well that's a relief. Mom smiled. So, have you given any more thought to what high school you want to go to? I know you've had your heart set on you. Can you be a hero? Not without a quirk. Izuku gave a strained smile. I'm not really sure anymore. Don't get me wrong, UA is a great school, it's just that I'm not sure it's realistic. Inko got a look on her face that was halfway between relief and pity, like she wasn't sure how she was supposed to feel. Izuku could relate. He finished his food and stood to take his dishes to the sink. Thank you for the food, Mom. I think I'm going to go to bed early tonight. Okay, baby. Inko stood to give him a hug. Just know that I'll support you, whatever you decide. Okay? Izuku smiled for real this time. That means a lot. I love you. I love you too, baby. Izuku woke up to his alarm at 1 a.m. and quickly silenced his phone. Mom was a deep sleeper, but that still didn't mean he could be as loud as he wanted without waking her up. He used the light from his phone and rifled through his closet until he found the hoodie and mask he'd just bought, then quickly pulled on an old pair of black jeans that had gotten ripped when Kaken pushed him down the stairs last month and a black long-sleeved shirt. He put on the hoodie, but held the goggles in his hand for a long moment before finally just stuffing them in the hoodie pocket. Even though he was technically going out as a vigilante, he wasn't actually planning on stopping any crimes tonight. Sure, Izuku's neighborhood wasn't the best, but there were always heroes patrolling during the day, so there shouldn't be too much crime at night either, right? Even if there was, Izuku didn't actually have to get involved. He just wanted to go out and figure out what the streets were like at night. They were bound to look different than they did during the day, and if Izuku was actually planning on being a vigilante long-term, it'd be best if he didn't get lost just because it was dark. Izuku slipped on his shoes and made sure they were tied tightly before slipping out the front door and locking it behind him. Then he started to wander. Without the goggles, he just looked like a normal, if slightly idiotic, teen on a midnight walk. He figured he could always slip the goggles on if he ran into any trouble, but until then they would just look suspicious. The city looked strange at night. During the day, the streets were crowded and Izuku was constantly being distracted by the sheer variety of quirks he saw, but at night, the streets were practically deserted. Most of the people he saw were either homeless or drunk or both, but they weren't really harming anyone, so Izuku didn't need to get involved. He made mental notes of where the darkest alleys were or where the street lamps were burned out so that he could disappear quickly into the dark if he needed to, but there didn't seem to be any danger yet. Izuku had been walking for 20 minutes and was starting to wonder if he'd even run into any crime tonight when he heard it. This can't be all you've got on you. What kind of guy doesn't even carry a cell phone? I swear that's all I have. Izuku ran to the mouth of an alley and saw a group of 3 large thugs ganging up on a smaller teen. He grabbed his goggles from his hoodie pocket and was about to run in when one of the thugs hit the brick wall with his fist and noticeably cracked it. Oh no, that guy was strong. Izuku ducked behind a dumpster and tried to calm his breathing. There was no way he could fight guys like them. He didn't even have enough muscle to keep Kaken from beating him up. If he ran in there right now, he'd die. And just because Izuku was kinda apathetic about the whole death thing at the moment didn't mean he was ready to walk into certain death. Especially when that death was almost guaranteed to be extremely painful. But Izuku couldn't just do nothing. The kid was probably really scared, and he was starting to plead with the thugs, so Izuku couldn't just leave him. He needed to be saved. But Izuku couldn't do that, could he? He really was a useless Deku, wasn't he? What was he even good at? You can't do anything, Deku. Kaken had said a couple weeks ago. Well, he said that all the time, but that was the particular instance that came to mind. The only thing you're good at is running away. Izuku froze. He was good at running away. Most of the time when Kaken beat him up, it was because Izuku was trying to defend someone else, but if he was going after Izuku himself, he was usually able to run fast enough to avoid a beating. Izuku stood and ran, unnoticed by the thugs or their victim. It was a crazy plan and might very well get him caught on his first day as a vigilante, but he had to try. Izuku peeked around the corner and sure enough, Amplifier was talking to a fan. He'd spent so much time watching hero fights over the years that he practically had every hero's patrol route memorized, but he'd never thought it would come in handy for anything besides taking notes. Still, there were only a few heroes that were active at night, but Amplifier was one of them, mostly because she fit well into the bar and nightlife scene and was able to control most of the drunks. She was also the closest to the mugging Izuku had witnessed. Making sure his goggles were secure and his hood was up, Izuku grabbed a medium-sized rock and chucked it at Amplifier, wincing when it hit her on the arm. He hoped he hadn't hurt her. What? Who did that? Izuku waited until Amplifier saw him, then gave her a shaky smile so that she knew his attack had been intentional. Then he ran. Hey, kid, get back here. He glanced behind him and smiled in triumph when he saw that she was following him. He didn't really know how fast Amplifier could run, but she had to be in shape if she was a pro. Izuku sped up both so that they could get to the mugging faster and so that she wouldn't catch him. The alley was just around the next corner. Stop. Help. Shut up. Izuku ducked into a doorway and watched as Amplifier looked torn. On the one hand, she wanted to go after the punk kid that had thrown a rock at her, but on the other, the kid being mugged was obviously in more immediate danger. She cursed, then ran into the alley to stop the mugging. Izuku smiled, ran over to one of the buildings bordering the alley and started climbing the fire escape. Yeah, it probably wasn't very vigilante-like to stay and watch the fight, but it wasn't like he was actually a vigilante anyway, right? Izuku ended up watching the entire fight from the roof. His fingers twitched and he decided that he'd have to add a portable notebook to his vigilante outfit. Amplifier's quirk was better for evacuation, since her voice quirk was all volume and very little power, but she was able to imitate some of Present Mix's moves here since it was a small space and her opponents were in very close range. Mostly though, she used some form of mixed martial arts to take down the thugs. Izuku stood and started imitating some of her moves to get them down in his brain. If he ever wanted to actually fight anyone, it'd be good to have at least some ideas of what to do, even if he didn't actually have any formal training. He'd have to set aside some time to practice every day if he wanted to get better, but watch and learn, right? Izuku smiled as Amplifier finished fighting the last thug and went to comfort the victim. He'd done it. He'd saved that kid. Well, he hadn't actually done it, but he'd led Amplifier to the fight. After the thugs had all been subdued, Izuku climbed back down to the street and ran off to find another crime to stop. He may not be as strong as Kaken, but he could still save people by playing to his strengths. And what was a useless Deku like him good at? Running away. Izuku's everything hurt. How far had he ended up running last night? It couldn't have been more than a few miles, right? He'd come across 2 more muggings after that first one, so had to run to pick up a hero, then had to run back to the crime. Okay, so maybe he'd run quite a bit, but still, he shouldn't be this sore, should he? Izuku, you're going to be late for school. Izuku groaned and forced himself out of bed. He must be even more out of shape than he'd thought. He'd definitely have to change that if he wanted to keep outrunning heroes. Izuku smiled as he got dressed. He'd saved people last night. After giving his mom a quick kiss on the cheek, Izuku was out the door and on his way to school. He had to walk carefully to avoid limping, but he'd had more than enough practice with hiding injuries that hiding sore muscles wasn't nearly as difficult as he'd been afraid it would be. Hopefully Kaken wouldn't want to use Izuku as quirk practice before class. With how sore he was, he might not be able to run away fast enough. Izuku frowned. Would he be able to go out tonight? He needed to be pretty fast to outrun heroes, so if he was too sore, he might get caught. But it had been so satisfying? Izuku didn't know if it was the rush he liked or if it was as simple as saving people, but either way, he didn't want to wait to get back out there. Stretching helped with soreness, didn't it? He'd have to start stretching every night before he left so he didn't hurt himself. Maybe he should look up warm-ups too? Izuku was so distracted planning his new nightly routine that he didn't see one of Kaken's lackeys stick out his foot to trip him until he was already falling. He hit the ground hard and the contents of his backpack scattered all over the hall. The other students simply pretended not to see as they trampled his notes and Izuku felt his eyes start to water. Look guys, Deku's clumsy and a crybaby. Izuku tried to blink back the tears as he scrambled over the floor, trying to pick up his papers before they were ripped beyond repair. There was a pair of teachers chatting a little further down the hall, but they didn't so much as glance at Izuku even when he cried out as one of the meaner students stepped on his fingers. Oh sorry Deku, I didn't see you there. The kid's smile gave away his insincerity, not that Izuku had been expecting an actual apology anyway. He finished shoving everything back into his bag and stood to get to class, trying to avoid everyone's eyes as he wiped away the tears. He's such a useless weakling, why does he even exist? Izuku kept his head down and did his best to ignore the whispers as he walked into the classroom and made his way to his seat. Kaken was still refusing to look at him, which Izuku understood. Kaken hadn't asked for Izuku to run in to save him, so he must still be mad about that. Izuku should probably apologize, shouldn't he? But knowing Kaken, that might make the whole thing worse. He should just leave it alone for now, right? If things got worse, he would apologize, but until then maybe Kakin would just forget about it or chalk the whole thing up to Deku being an idiot. Though, it was strange that Kakin hadn't said a single word to him since he'd stopped him on the street after the sludge villain attack. Normally, if their other classmates tried to do something, Kakin would come along and do it better to prove that he was still the best. So since everyone had decided to be crueler to Izuku, well, he just thought it would make a lot of sense for Kakin to use this situation to assert his dominance. So why wasn't he? Izuku quickly silenced what he was mentally calling his vigilante alarm and rolled out of bed. His soreness had gradually decreased throughout the day, but it hadn't completely gone away, so he'd probably have to pace himself tonight. Still in his pajamas, Izuku leaned over to touch his toes and grimaced as his legs protested against the stretch. He then moved one foot back so he could stretch his calf better. He'd spent an hour that afternoon just looking up different types of stretches, specifically stretches that were good for people who did a lot of running. He'd never actually realized how important flexibility was to physical activity. He spent the next half hour just running through the stretches he'd researched until he was at least marginally less sore and stiff, then got dressed in his vigilante outfit just like he had the night before. This time, however, he grabbed a small green notebook that he'd bought on the way home and stuffed it and a few pens in his back pocket before heading out. He'd have to figure out how to notate the moves that the heroes used if he wanted to study them later, since there wouldn't be time to do his usual detailed drawings in the middle of a fight. But stick figures be enough? As he walked, Izuku thought through the patrol schedules he'd memorized. It was a Thursday night, so who would be out? Well, Rocklock often worked later during the week so he could take the weekends off, probably to be with his family if what he said in interviews was any indication. Then there was Enigma, but her gigantification quirk might allow her to catch him too quickly, so he should probably try to avoid using her if possible. He might be able to catch Death Arms if the hero decided to stay out later for whatever reason. MT Lady probably wouldn't be patrolling at night if her media-mongering debut was any indication, so she wouldn't be any help. It was surprising now that he thought about it, just how few heroes patrolled at night. If he was out walking at 2 in the afternoon rather than 2 in the morning, he'd be able to have his pick of at least 5 or 6 heroes on any given day, but well, he couldn't get mad at heroes for getting tired. But from what Izuku had seen the night before, there wasn't less crime at night. If anything, there might even be more crime at night, since there weren't as many people out to be witnesses and there weren't as many heroes patrolling the streets. If Izuku were a villain, he'd probably be completely nocturnal for those reasons alone. Izuku sighed. Hopefully Amplifier wouldn't get too annoyed with him if he had to use her again. He'd already used her twice last night and she probably had better things that she usually did during her patrols, so he'd have to try to spread it out as much as possible, at least until he got strong enough to start fighting criminals himself. But Izuku had decided that the running had 2 purposes. The first was obviously to get heroes to stop crimes in progress, but the second was to build muscle and stamina so he stood a chance when and if he ever felt confident enough to fight. Not that anyone would care if anything happened to you anyway. Izuku shook his head. He didn't want to die before he had the chance to save anyone. Besides, he knew that getting a bully to change his targets was temporary at best. If he died too quickly at the start of a fight before the real victim had a chance to get away, then he really wouldn't have done any good. Not to mention that if he died too quickly it might just make the villain more angry and end up making things worse for the person he'd been trying to help. Not that anyone would really be surprised if that happened, he was a useless Deku after all. Izuku caught movement in the corner of his eye and looked through the window of the 24-hour convenience store he sometimes bought snacks at to see someone threatening the cashier with an electricity quirk. Who was the closest hero to here? Rocklock? Izuku ignored the burning in his legs as he took off running as fast as he could. So, how's the wife? Amplifier asked. Getting ready to pop? Rocklock shook his head. She's not due for another few. She's already complaining about how big she is though. I just tell her that means there's more of her to love. Oh, smooth Romeo, smooth. Usually Rocklock didn't stop to talk to other heroes, but it was a slow night and Amplifier had been chasing down a drunk that had been harassing women where she usually patrolled. He'd helped take him down by immobilizing his clothes, and she'd stuck around after the police had picked him up. Who knows, maybe he'd run into a situation where he could use the extra help. Well, there is a reason she fell in love. Ow. Something hit him on his calf and he looked down to see a rock. He whipped around to see who threw it and caught sight of what looked to be a kid in a green hoodie and goggles smile at him before running away. Let's go. Amplifier started following the kid, but Rock held her back. But he's just some hooligan, it's not gonna do any good to run him down. Amplifier shook her head. No, I saw the kid yesterday too, and when I chased him, he led me straight to 2 different muggings. Don't worry, we're not gonna try and catch him, but if that kid throws a rock at you, he wants you to chase him. She started running again and Rock shook his head as he followed. He still wasn't convinced that chasing the kid was productive, but Amplifier had proven to be a decent hero, so he'd trust her for now. And well, it was a slow night, so if nothing else, following this kid was something to do. Izuku stopped as soon as he realized that Rock and Amplifier weren't following him. Had Amplifier decided he wasn't worth her time anymore? He hadn't been trying to get her, but she'd been talking to Rock and there wasn't any time to go find another hero. Should he try to go find Death Arms? Probably, but by the time he got to Death Arms' patrol route, the robber would be gone. He really was useless, wasn't he? He couldn't even get a hero correctly. Izuku startled as he heard footsteps behind him and grinned as he saw Rock and Amplifier running toward him. Rock looked skeptical about the whole thing, but that didn't matter right now. What mattered right now was making sure that the convenience store robber got caught. Izuku took off and hoped that they weren't too late. Situations like robberies could often take a turn for the worse extremely quickly. His breath was starting to get painful as he pushed himself even harder. They couldn't be too late, they couldn't. Izuku didn't know whether to laugh or cry as he turned the corner to see the robber leaving the store. Was the cashier okay? Izuku didn't know what he would do if he wasn't. Wait, how would the heroes know that the guy was a villain? Izuku didn't stop running, but leaned down and scooped up an empty soda can that someone had tossed on the sidewalk. He only hesitated a moment before he lobbed the can as hard as he could at the villain's head. Hopefully this wouldn't be the idiot move that killed him. Imagine what the kids at school would say. Did you hear that Deku killed himself by throwing a soda can? Seriously, what a lame way to go, but what else did we expect from someone so worthless? The villain turned around in rage, then saw the heroes behind him, and Izuku almost cried with relief when the villain decided to activate his electricity quirk and charged. Now the heroes wouldn't have any doubt on who they were supposed to attack. Izuku dodged behind a parked car and used the car's rubber tire to shield him from the attack. He poked his head out and Izuku smiled as he saw that Rock and Amplifier had engaged the villain. Now what? Oh yeah, the cashier. Izuku flung open the door and ran to the counter. The guy wasn't standing at the counter like he should be, so where was he? Had he gone to a back room to recover from the stress, or was he? Help! The voice was soft and laced with pain, but a dead person couldn't talk, so that meant the cashier was alive. Izuku nearly panicked when he ran around the counter and saw the man lying on the ground, electrical burns covering most of his face and arms. Izuku was familiar with burns and those looked like they hurt. A lot. He forced himself to calm down, but wasn't able to force a smile onto his face. Sir, do you have a phone? Oh, on the counter. Izuku hurried and dialed the police. Yes, hello? There's a guy here with electrical burns, at least 2nd or 3rd degree. Yes, it was a villain attack. Somebody robbed the convenience store on Random Street. Yeah, we're still here, hurry. Izuku put the phone down and knelt beside the cashier. Are you okay? Oh wait, obviously you're not okay. You just got robbed and you're hurt and… How did you, the man rasped, know about the robbery? Oh, I brought the heroes. They're fighting the guy outside. Oh, those burns look bad, let's get that okay, yeah. Izuku stood and found the burn cream and bandages. It only took a few seconds, as he already knew exactly where they were kept because he bought them so frequently. Maybe he'd have to thank Kaken when this was all over? No, Kaken would probably just find that annoying. Izuku shook his head. He needed to focus. He grabbed a rag that was underneath the counter and ran over to the soda fountain to wet it with cold water, then started dabbing the wet washcloth on the burns, being extra careful not to rub so he didn't do any more damage to the skin. Ice? The man asked as Izuku set to work. It's so hot, wouldn't ice be better? Izuku shook his head. No, Ice can shock your system or make the area so numb you can't tell if further damage is being done. Don't worry, once we get the burn cream on, it'll hurt a little less. And I am sure the paramedics will be able to give you something for pain when they get here. The man nodded and closed his eyes, and Izuku started to apply the cream. He was just wrapping the burns when the door opened and he heard Amplifier's voice. "Kid? Are you in here? Is everyone okay? I could have sworn I saw him come in here." "I'm here, Amplifier," Izuku yelled. The cashier got burned by that guy's quirk. Amplifier walked around the counter and stopped when she saw Izuku treating the man's wounds. "Wow, kid, you look like you know what you're doing." Izuku shrugged. "I've had a lot of practice." He finished tying off the final bandage and stood. "I'd better leave this to you guys. I already called the ambulance, so they should be here any minute. You should probably stay with him until they get here though. I've heard electrical burns can be tricky." Amplifier nodded and knelt beside the man as Izuku hurried toward where he thought the back entrance was. Just because he wasn't technically a vigilante didn't mean it was a good idea to stick around until the cops came, especially since the heroes were a lot more qualified to deal with the situation than he was anyway. At this point, Izuku would just get in the way. "Kid." Izuku turned back to see Amplifier staring at him. "Thanks." Izuku gave her a bright smile before he turned and left. Now to find someone else to save. Shota looked across the desk at Tsukachi as he finished the paperwork for his latest arrest. "I heard you got yourself a new vigilante." Tsukachi rolled his eyes. If you can even call him that. The kid hasn't actually done anything yet. His MO is that he'll find a crime, then go and find a hero. Seems like he's doing some good then. Tsukachi looked tired. "Yeah, but it turns out that most heroes don't take kindly to having rocks thrown at them." Shota snorted. "He throws rocks at them?" Tsukachi nodded. "At least he's not actually hitting them with the rocks anymore. The first week or so, the heroes all came in with mild bruises. A few days ago he started just tossing the rocks at their feet, though, so that's an improvement. His goal was always to get the heroes' attention, not hurt them, wasn't it?" Shota said. "The rocks were just a way to make sure they chased him. He was probably trying to get them angry so they'd pay attention to him." "That's what we decided too." Tsukachi offered Shota a cup of coffee that he gratefully accepted. Word of him has been spreading pretty fast though, and heroes in the area are starting to recognize him. That's probably part of why he's stopped hitting them with the rocks. Once he's got their attention, heroes know that they need to follow him. Apparently he's pretty good at sniffing out crimes too, and most of the heroes don't mind the extra help, considering he's not really hurting anything. "What's he look like?" Shota asked. "In case I come across him?" "Well, he's kind of plain as far as vigilantes go," Tsukachi said, handing him a sketch of the vigilante. "He wears a dark green hoodie with matching goggles, then black jeans. The most flashy thing about him is his red shoes, but even those don't appear to be a statement piece." Shota looked at the sketch. There really wasn't anything that's special or eye-catching about him. "It's strange, most vigilantes I've met try to go for something more distinctive. This guy kinda reminds me of myself. He doesn't care what he looks like as long as he gets the job done." "Yeah, most vigilantes are failed heroes, so they see themselves as heroes, but this kid is different," Tsukachi said. "He doesn't even try to fight the villains." "You said kid twice now." Shota looked at the sketch again. "Just how old is he?" "Early 20s. Tsukachi shook his head. Amplifier's the only one that has had any close contact with him, but she said that, based on his voice and the way he held himself, he's a teenager, and a young one at that. She pegged him at around 12 or 13 because he was so short and skinny, but I think it's more likely that we're looking in the 16 to 18 range. Since most vigilantes are failed heroes, he's got to be old enough to have taken and failed the entrance exams. But this kid doesn't see himself as a hero the way other vigilantes do," Shota pointed out. Crawler, Popstep, and even Stendhal all saw themselves as heroes even without licenses, and they each came up with their own particular brand of dress and behavior. This kid doesn't even fight. Has he even given himself a name yet? No, even when he spoke with Amplifier he didn't introduce himself. Tsukachi said, "But the heroes who've encountered him so far have taken to calling him the Green Guide." Shota snorted. The green guide? Seriously? They couldn't think of anything less obvious? Tsukachi shrugged. Well, the kid wears green and leads them to crimes in progress. I don't know, the alliteration is kinda catchy. Shota rolled his eyes. Yeah, sure, 'cause that's obviously super important to the kid. He sighed. It's just that I hope he keeps staying out of fights. If he gets in any deeper, he'll only end up getting himself killed. Izuku wandered the now familiar streets in search of crime. He'd been doing this for 2 weeks now. 2 weeks. He still hadn't mustered the courage to get in a single fight, but the heroes were actually starting to recognize and trust him. He'd never realized just how lax heroes were toward vigilantes. Maybe it was because he wasn't actually doing a lot of vigilante-type stuff, but the heroes never tried to track him down after a fight or anything. And Izuku was actually starting to get stronger. The first few days had been terrifyingly painful just from the dramatic increase in physical activity, but his body was starting to get used to it now. Maybe he was just imagining it, but when he'd gotten dressed before going out, his calves had been noticeably firmer. And he was definitely getting more flexible from all the stretching he did before and after his patrols. He was also getting more familiar with the sounds that happened every night. There had been a few times in which he peeked into an alley expecting to find a fight, only to find that it was just a cat that had knocked over a trashcan lid, but now he was getting better at recognizing that sound, even if he still double-checked to make sure since he didn't want to miss anything. That familiarity with nighttime sounds was why a slight rustling accompanied by what sounded like muffled whimpers was enough to raise red flags. He rushed in the direction of the sound and his eyes widened when he saw a guy with some kind of mole quirk pressing a brunette woman against the brick wall using one of his massive hands to cover her mouth while the other wandered to less innocent places. He should get a hero. Which ones were close to here again? But Izuku had watched a lot of fights, not only over the last 2 weeks, but during his entire hero-obsessed lifetime. He was familiar with battle stances and how to not get knocked down by an opponent, and this guy looked like a strong breeze would blow him over. Probably, the only reason that the girl hadn't been able to escape was because he was so much bigger than she was. The guy was completely off balance. Izuku should really get a hero. He was wasting time, but his mind couldn't help running through how he'd beat this guy if he had to fight him. He had a mole quirk, which meant that he probably relied mostly on his sense of smell, since his eyesight was most likely poor. He also didn't have good situation awareness, since Izuku had been standing there for almost a minute by this point and he still hadn't noticed. Oh no. He'd been standing there for almost a minute. He needed to go get a hero. Unfortunately, the woman had more situational awareness than her attacker, and right as Izuku was about to turn and run, she caught his eye. Her muffled screams got more frantic and Izuku couldn't help himself as he ran forward to save her. Crap. What was he supposed to do? This guy was so big and Izuku still didn't know how to fight at all. Okay, the mole quirk meant that the guy was mostly blind, but he could still probably smell Izuku if he wasn't careful, so Izuku glanced around and saw a half-full takeout container on the floor by one of the dumpsters. He picked it up and swallowed down his own disgust. Hey mole man. Oh, Kaken would be ashamed of that insult. It wasn't even an insult, it was just an observation that was phrased as an insult. Like Deku. But even if it wasn't very creative, it did the trick and Mole Man turned around only to get a face full of half-rotten takeout. His heightened sense of smell would no longer be a problem. Mole Man let go of the woman as he pawed desperately at his face to wipe away the stench, but Izuku didn't give him much of a chance as he lunged for his legs. The guy was already off balance, so if Izuku could just trip him. The man fell hard onto his back and Izuku smiled briefly before he realized that down did not mean out. Mole Man grabbed Izuku's leg and yanked him down as well, then let go as he scrambled to his feet and kicked Izuku in the gut. Izuku grimaced, but he'd been kicked before, so he just shrugged off the pain and got up. Okay, so plan A didn't work. What was plan B? Who was he kidding? He hadn't even had a plan A. Okay, so how did the heroes beat villains? Well, they beat them with their quirks, but that wasn't going to work here. So what could Izuku outwait? Midnight had her whip right? That's how she beat female villains or villains that could hold their breath for a long time. So if he couldn't use a quirk to defeat Mole Man, maybe he could use some kind of weapon? He really should have thought this through. He had a pencil in his back pocket, but that was it. Mole Man suddenly reached out and slammed Izuku against the wall, holding him a foot off the ground by his throat. Izuku struggled to breathe as the hand started to crush his windpipe and tried to blink away the black that was starting to encroach on the edges of his vision. Was he going to die? Had the girl gotten away? He glanced over to the side and saw her watching the fight with wide eyes. He couldn't die yet. Izuku grabbed his pencil and jammed it into Mole Man's hand. Mole Man screamed and let Izuku go. That trick probably wasn't going to work a second time, and Mole Man was getting more angry by the minute. What else could he use? Well, he'd need to knock the guy out. He wasn't strong enough yet to do that by punching like All Might did, but some kind of blunt force trauma would probably be best. Oh, that sounded so bad. Maybe it was for the best that Izuku couldn't be a hero. As Mole Man recovered from being stabbed, Izuku glanced around the alley again until he saw a dented can of beans that someone had thrown away. He ran over to it as Mole Man charged and grabbed his legs. Izuku slammed onto the cement belly first, but managed to grab the can right as Mole Man started to drag him backwards. Izuku twisted his body and slammed the can into Mole Man's hands with enough force to make him let go. His body was running on pure adrenaline at this point, and it seemed like everything was simultaneously going too fast and too slow. Izuku managed to dodge another grab and used his can to bludgeon Mole Man's shoulder. Mole Man aimed a punch for his head, but he was broadcasting his movements the way Kaken sometimes did, so it was easy enough for Izuku to duck. The punch threw Mole Man off balance again, and Izuku hit him with some weird mix of a punch and a backhand, making him stumble back. Izuku didn't wait for Mole Man to recover before he launched his next attack. The can got slippery as Mole Man's nose started to bleed. Or maybe some of that blood was from Izuku's knuckles. Izuku didn't stop hitting though until his opponent was on the ground. He waited tensely for a long moment until he was certain that Mole Man was knocked out, then turned to the girl he'd just saved. Are you okay? She looked at him in shock. Am I okay? You just fought a guy twice your size. Izuku looked down at the guy on the floor. Actually, I think he's probably more like 3 times my size. I'm pretty small, but I don't think his size is just because of his quirk. Earth to kid. Are you actually okay? He looked like he hurt you. Izuku shrugged. It's nothing I'm not used to, don't worry about it. The woman didn't look any less worried, but Izuku decided that trying to reassure her probably wouldn't do any good. He turned to leave, but almost tripped over Mole Man, who was still unconscious on the ground. Oh, almost forgot about him. I should really get some zip ties or something to bring out. I wondered, Dio, you have any zip ties on you? The woman let out a stressed huff of laughter. No? Are you telling me you ran into the fight without any way to tie the guy up? Izuku shrunk back a little. I normally just run away and get the heroes. I'm sorry, I'm really bad at this. I'm not even a real vigilante. No, you're doing great. The woman tried to reassure him, and Izuku gave her a shaky smile. He wasn't doing great. There's got to be something around here we can use, he muttered. Maybe if I can find some rope? Oh, I can tear this old t-shirt into strips. Probably won't stop him for long, but hopefully the police will arrive before that'll be a problem. The woman stared at him as he tied up Mole Man as tightly as he could. Do you need me to do anything? Izuku shook his head. If you could call the cops after I leave, that'd be great. I mean, you should probably stick around so you can explain what happened, 'cause otherwise they might not actually be able to arrest this guy, but if he starts waking up, you should probably run. The woman nodded and Izuku grabbed the fire escape. He didn't want her to have to wait too long, which she probably would have to if he just walked out onto the street. Wait! Izuku stopped with his hands still on the fire escape. Yes? Are you hurt? Do you need me to give you first aid? The woman shook her head. No, you just never told me your vigilante name. What am I supposed to call you, green guy? Izuku shrugged. Sure, if that works. I don't really care what people call me, I just want to help people. With that, he turned around and scrambled up the fire escape. He saw the woman getting out her phone as he got to the roof, so that was good. He should probably try to take the rooftops home so he didn't run into any of the cops as they drove to the alley. He'd never hopped from building to building before, but it couldn't be too hard, right? Izuku backed up and got a running start as he prepared to jump. only the chicken out with a yelp as he arrived at the edge of the roof. He tried to calm his breathing down. That was a lot scarier than he'd hoped it would be. He could try again, but that he really didn't want to. It was probably best not to try again, anyway, since if he jumped and ended up falling then they'd think it was suicide and that would defeat his whole purpose of being a vigilante, which was so that no one would get hurt when he died. He gave a determined nod, found another fire escape that led into the next alley over and climbed down. Then he lowered his hood, put away his goggles and started walking home, grimacing as the adrenaline wore off and he realized how much pain he was in. He should call it a night. He wouldn't be able to run fast enough to help anyone in this state. Good thing he already had practiced treating his own injuries. Hina smiled as she watched the vigilante disappear and dialed her boss. She'd call the police in a minute, but they would ask her to stay on the line until someone arrived and she didn't want to wait to make this call. What are you doing calling me at 3 in the morning? I have tomorrow's headline. What happened? She grinned. I was just saved by a new vigilante. I'm fine, don't worry. He seems to just be starting out, so I'm positive no other paper has talked about him yet. He said he often gets heroes to respond to crimes that would otherwise be overlooked and he's super sweet and nervous. I think he might be a teenager. Really? Her boss sounded much more awake. That is a headline, maybe not front page, but there's definitely a story there. Get me a pace by morning and we'll run it on the website. If it gets enough hits I'll give you the go-ahead to do more research and we'll do a full piece by the end of the week. What's your vigilante's name? Hina frowned. He'd said that green guy was fine, but a name like that wouldn't sell any papers. She needed something flashier, something that would make people curious when they saw it in the headline. Well, he was green, and he didn't seem to care what people called him, so. Viridian, she said. Let's call him Viridian. Shota tightened his capture weapon and pushed the villain more firmly against the wall. It's illogical to resist, just tell me what I need to know. Dude, it's just some drags. The villain said. If you have a problem with that then maybe you should get out more, I've got a couple samples that'd be good for a first-timer. Shota rolled his eyes. Yes, offer to sell drags to the hero that's arresting you. And honestly, if it were just party drags, I probably wouldn't care that much, but this is Trigger, so I'll ask you one more time, where do you get the drags? F you. Shota sighed. Fine, have it your way. He dialed Tsukachi and waited until the detective's half-awake voice groaned over the line. Could you send a car? I've got a perp to bring in for processing and interrogation. Tsukachi looked up from his paperwork as Eraser walked in the villain he'd just arrested. The guy was probably a low-level dealer like the others that Eraser had brought in, but there was always the hope that the next villain would know who was behind Trigger. Interrogation room 8 is open, Eraser. You can put him in there. Eraser grunted in acknowledgement and dragged the thug toward the back of the station as Tsukachi poured them both some coffee. He'd have to go interrogate the guy later, since he was one of the detectives on the Trigger investigation, but that could wait a bit until this paperwork was done. Leaving the perps to wait for a few minutes helped establish control of the situation anyway. Shota finally sat down on the other side of his desk and grabbed the coffee, then grimaced. Tsukachi, you didn't mention that the station had switched out their coffee for paint thinner. Tsukachi just laughed. Oh, you're just mad that Mizudafu doesn't have your favorite cat cafe. What can I say, the Hata brothers make a mean cup of coffee. Shota shrugged. You got those forms? I want to get this over with as fast as possible. Tsukachi shook his head, but grabbed the villain intake form from the drawer at his right and handed it to Shota, who started to fill it out with both annoyance and boredom. Paperwork wasn't fun by any means, and Shota would rather be patrolling the streets looking for more info for the Trigger investigation, but bureaucracy was a part of life, so he had to put up with it. They kept working in companionable silence for a few minutes until the doors to the station flew open again and Amplifier came bounding in with a villain in tow and took him straight to the holding cell. Why is she so loud? Shota grumbled. Tsukachi raised an eyebrow. She hasn't even said anything yet. Exactly. Even her presence is loud enough to draw attention. It's annoying. Oh, don't be a spoil-sport, Eraser. Amplifier grinned as she grabbed a chair to sit beside him. You're just mad because you wouldn't be noticed by a rat. That's intentional, you know. Shota said as Tsukachi handed Amplifier the villain intake form. People don't notice me unless I want them to notice me. Maybe that's why you haven't run into our little vigilante guide yet. Amplifier said. He just doesn't know you exist. Shota rolled his eyes. I think it's much more likely that UA is out of his comfort zone, and since I always stick to that area unless I'm following a lead, we just haven't had a chance to run into each other yet. Sure, Amplifier grinned. Whatever you say, Eraser. Was that villain one of the green guides? Tsukachi asked. That depends on your definition. Amplifier said. If you mean did he lead me to the guy, then yes, but if you mean did he take the guy down himself, then no. Shota frowned. I thought the green guide didn't ever take down villains on his own. Tsukachi sighed. He didn't, at least until last night when we responded to a call about an attempted assault, only to find the perp already knocked out and tied up with pieces of an old t-shirt. The victim said the guy who did it was a kid in a green hoodie and goggles. Shota rubbed his temples to try and ease the coming headache. This problem child was going to be the death of him. How? From what you told me, the kid is skin and bones. How did he take down an actual villain? With a tin can. Shota stopped and stared at Tsukachi. He had to have heard that wrong. What? Tsukachi nodded. You heard me right. According to the victim, the green guide started fighting the guy, but couldn't get the upper hand until he grabbed a can of beans and started beating the guy with it like it was a pair of improvised brass knuckles. It was pretty brutal but also effective. Shota didn't know whether to be proud of the kid for his quick thinking under pressure or angry because he ran straight into danger. Probably both. Amplifier squealed. Our little boy is growing up, taking down villains all by himself and everything. Shota scowled. I don't think that's a good thing. Yeah, I think I have to agree with Eraser on this one. Tsukachi said. The victim said that he seemed in over his head. I'd much rather he kept running to get heroes rather than running into fights he's unprepared for. Oh, come on. Amplifier groaned. You guys gotta admit that beating a criminal with nothing more than your wits and a tin can is pretty impressive. Shota just shot her an unimpressed look. Nothing more than wits, a tin can, and a probable speed quirk. Come on. Shota sighed. Fine, I'll admit that he's quick-witted and definitely good at using improvised weapons, but the kid obviously lacks the required training. I don't want him getting in fights if he's just gonna get himself killed. Well, Crawler and Pop Step didn't have any formal training either when they first started out. Tsukachi pointed out. That may be true, but they also had Knuckle Duster to mentor them and get them out of any tough scrapes. Shota argued. The green guide doesn't even have that. Well, then maybe you should fill that role. Amplifier grinned. Shota glared at her. I have enough brats to worry about at you, thanks. I don't need to add teaching a wannabe on top of that. Amplifier shrugged. Just a thought, Eraser, considering how protective you are of a kid you've never even met. Oh, and about the kid's name, I don't think he's going by Green Guide anymore. Tsukachi furrowed his brow in confusion. What? Why change it? Amplifier looked between the two of them in shock. Did you guys not see the article this morning? They shook their heads and Amplifier smiled and got out her phone. Apparently the woman he saved last night is a reporter. Since he didn't give her a vigilante name to call him, she's named him Viridian. Kinda catchy, right? Tsukachi frowned. How did I not see this? Amplifier shrugged. Probably because the keywords were wrong. You've most likely got your computer set up to ping you if the news mentions a green guide, but because this reporter used a different name, it didn't trip your system. I like Viridian better anyway. It is easier to say. Vigilantes gaining public notoriety is never a good thing. Shota grumbled. It goes straight to their heads and they end up putting themselves in even more danger to impress their fans. He sighed. The kid is probably soaking up his fame as we speak. Deku was freaking out. He couldn't get that article out of his head, even as he ran around the streets leading heroes to crimes. When Izuku had seen the article on his way home from school, he'd had to fight off a panic attack and he almost hadn't gone out that night. He didn't want to be famous. The more people paid attention to him, the more likely it was that they'd figure out that he was quirkless and the faster he could say goodbye to any positive reputation he'd gained. He wasn't even technically a vigilante, so why did he have to have a name? But apparently that woman he'd saved was a reporter? So she'd written about how he'd taken down the villain, and she'd apparently done some digging to see that he normally stayed out of the fights himself. Izuku didn't deserve to have articles written about him like the heroes did, so he couldn't help feeling like he'd tricked that reporter somehow. He hadn't been trying to fool her into thinking that he wasn't worthless, but that's apparently what happened since her article was so positive. He'd just been trying to help her. Which was ultimately why he was out on the streets again tonight. Sure, he wasn't necessarily happy about the article, but he also wasn't about to let that stop him from helping people either. And he was helping people. He was helping the heroes find the people that needed saving. He was doing good. But he should probably start carrying weapons if he ever planned to jump into a fight again. Between tending to his injuries and everything with the article, he'd completely forgotten about adding weapons to his costume that afternoon, but it wasn't a big deal. He was still covered in scrapes and bruises from his fight with Mole Man last night, so it wouldn't be a good idea to get into any more fights so soon, so he didn't need the weapons quite yet, but it was still a good thing to brainstorm. He'd almost considered getting a baseball bat, but there were a couple problems with that. While it would be a useful bludgeon-type weapon, it was too bulky. He wouldn't be able to easily run if he had to be constantly hefting the bat, so it would actually prevent him from saving people, which was the exact opposite of what he wanted. Not to mention the fact that he'd never been into any sports, so if he came home with a baseball bat, Mom would ask way too many questions that Izuku really didn't want to answer. His weapons would need to be small. He needed to be able to fit them in his pockets so he could run easily and so he could go incognito if he needed to, so that meant that anything like a staff was out. Maybe. He heard someone calling for help and peeked in on the situation before running off to get a hero. He could worry about what weapons he needed later. For now, though, Izuku had people to save. When Izuku rolled out of bed and immediately started his nightly stretches before getting dressed in his vigilante clothes. Was it weird that the middle of the night was turning into his favorite time of day? It probably was. Kaken would probably think he was crazy for wanting to go out in the middle of the night to bother heroes. Izuku snuck out to the front door, but froze with his hand on the doorknob. Hadn't he decided yesterday that he really needed to take weapons with him? He hesitated another long moment while he debated the merits of just going out weaponless again. He could always just rely on what trash he could find, right? It had worked just fine last time. But while he could do that, he probably shouldn't. Mom would kill him if she knew he was running into fights without any kind of weapon or plan of attack, and while he wasn't planning on her finding out, it was the principle of the thing. So something small and easy to hide, but also something he could grab quickly so he didn't cut too much into his vigilante time tonight. Maybe he should bring some sort of knife? He turned on his phone's flashlight and went into the kitchen. Were there any knives that Mom wouldn't miss? He obviously couldn't take any from the knife block. They'd be missed immediately. He might be able to get away with taking a steak knife, but it probably wouldn't be a good idea to put a knife in his pocket without any kind of sheath, would it? He'd just end up cutting himself as he tried to run get heroes, and that wouldn't do any good. He needed a knife with some kind of protection already built in. Izuku smiled as an idea occurred to him, and he started to rummage as quietly as he could in the junk drawer. It took him a while to find what he was looking for since they used it so infrequently, and he was starting to get scared that they'd actually lost it when his hand closed around the old box cutter. Izuku practiced extending and retracting the blade a few times to get a feel for it. Yeah, the cuts wouldn't be very deep, but they'd be enough to distract a villain in a pinch so Izuku could run away or find another opening. It was a good start. Now on to a bludgeoning weapon. On a whim, Izuku went to the pantry and grabbed a can of soup. Running around with a can wouldn't be good in the long run, since it was heavy and hard to hold, but he could always replace it with something more streamlined later. Besides, it had worked so well last time that he knew it was reliable. A can and a box cutter didn't feel like enough, though. Izuku was going to be fighting Quirkless against people with quirks, so he probably needed a few more weapons than most vigilantes did. He wished he had something like tonfa, but he didn't know how to use them, and they were just a bit larger than he was comfortable carrying around in his hoodie pocket. Some kind of stick would work pretty well, though, if only. Izuku quickly went to the hall closet where Mom kept her old crafting supplies. Hadn't she done a project with wooden dowels a few months ago? If Izuku was lucky, there'd be a few left. He grinned when he saw the dowels standing up against the wall. He grabbed two of the shorter pieces, each about 20 centimeters long and 3 around, but one was slightly shorter than the other. Izuku hoped that the difference wouldn't throw him too off balance if he had to use them in a fight. Now that he finally felt armed enough, Izuku turned off his flashlight and walked out the front door. He was ready. Izuku pressed himself against the wall to make sure he was completely hidden in the shadows while he watched the thugs. He had heard raised voices, so ran toward the side street and was currently hiding in an alley, but the thugs weren't actually doing anything. There were about 10 of them and they were probably part of a gang or something, but they seemed to be joking around and roughhousing, not doing anything nefarious. "When did your friend say she was coming?" one of the thugs asked. "And why did we have to meet her here? There are flies everywhere, man." "Oh, stop being such a baby." That guy seemed to be the leader. He had green skin and what looked like thorns on his face, which made Izuku wonder what his quirk was. "She'll be here soon." Izuku shook his head and turned away. There were other people who needed his help. There was no point in waiting around here. He was just about to leave when the first thug cried out in pain and Izuku whipped around to see him clutching a hand to his neck. "Demon fly bit me." Within a few seconds, each of the thugs slapped a hand to their necks and cried out. Those must be some vicious flies if they bit all of them, but why bite all of them at once? Izuku should run. Those bites looked painful and he didn't necessarily want to have to explain to his mom how he got an insect bite when he was supposedly at home in bed. He turned to leave again. "You beach. I'll kill you." Izuku watched in shock as the thugs all started powering up and attacking each other. What? And they all had such powerful quirks too. He thought quirks this powerful were rare, and the more powerful your quirk, the more likely you would be encouraged to be a hero, so a group of thugs all with powerful quirks was unheard of. But they were going crazy, like they were on drags or something, but they hadn't even been smoking. Just then, one of the thugs caught sight of him. "Boys, look, we've got a toothpick to crush." Izuku froze and swallowed thickly as every one of the thugs turned toward him. Time to run. Shota crouched on a rooftop overlooking the bar district. Normally this was Amplifier's territory, but she'd come down with the flu and had to call in sick, so Shota had agreed to cover her shift. He would usually be trying to track down leads on the Trigger case, but he hadn't gotten any new information recently. He was starting to get frustrated with the whole thing. Trigger had been in Japan for years now, and so far they had only been able to arrest low-level thugs and pawns and were no closer to finding the people behind the villain factory. He wouldn't admit it, but Shota was scared. People didn't do things for no reason, so there had to be some eventual goal to using drags to temporarily turn normal people into powerful villains, but Shota couldn't see it. Trigger on its own was bad enough, but the stuff it was sometimes cut with made the user violent and prone to attacking anyone in sight. And that wasn't even counting the people who had been abducted and had their bodies modified to accommodate their more powerful quirks. Hopefully, the people behind the villain factory weren't doing this to gear up to a major attack, but there was no way to know if they were. The dealers didn't know anything about the production of the drag, and even those higher up on the supply chain hadn't known anything about the kidnappings. Shota was just ready for this case to be over already. He was sick of not knowing anything. There was a crash off to his left, and Shota turned to see a kid running as fast as he could as he was chased by a mob of powered-up villains. The kid was wearing a green hoodie and goggles and kept glancing around as he ran like he was looking for someone. Was this the new vigilante Amplifier had told him about? It must be, but didn't Viridian lead heroes to villains and not the other way around? As the group got closer, Shota decided it didn't matter much. He needed to stop them before any civilians could be injured, which in the bar district was a distinct possibility. Dimen problem child, why couldn't he have left the villains where they were? Shota jumped down, startling Viridian, who stared at him with wide eyes that Shota could barely see behind his goggles, then tripped and landed flat on his stomach, making Shota snort. "Stay away from the fight, kid," he said. "I'll handle this." He cancelled the villain's quirks, then started to wrap as many as he could in his capture weapon, knocking them into each other and into the walls to disorient them. He couldn't see Viridian anymore, so hopefully the kid had enough sense to run away. Izuku watched with wide eyes as Eraserhead fought the thugs. Eraserhead? He'd been trying to get Amplifier, mostly because she was the closest and the thug's quirks were making it very hard for Izuku to stay ahead of them, but Eraserhead was even better. His quirk was so cool. Izuku could tell where he was looking just by seeing whose quirk could activate and whose couldn't. And then his hair. Did he have a secondary levitation quirk, or was there something about his hair floating that was necessary for his quirk? Maybe it was built into his quirk to make sure that the hair didn't get in his eyes? If that were the case, if Eraserhead was hanging upside down and activated his quirk, would his hair float upwards like it was defying gravity, like it did when he was standing up? Or would it obey the laws of physics and stay down so that it wouldn't risk getting in his eyes? Izuku was so caught up watching Eraserhead's quirk in action that he didn't notice that one of the thugs had gotten out of Eraserhead's line of sight and was looking straight at him. Izuku yelped as a tentacle wrapped around his ankle and started pulling him toward the grinning villain, who apparently had a squid quirk that gave him tentacles for hair. Izuku hurriedly reached into his pocket and grabbed the box cutter he'd brought, fumbling as he expended the blade, then slashed at the tentacle. The villain screamed and let go as dark blood started pouring out of the wound. He growled at Izuku, who was holding his knife in front of him like a lifeline, then launched several tentacles at him at once. Izuku slashed and dodged as fast as he could, thankful that he was used to dodging explosions. He managed to cut quite a few of the tentacles that were attacking him, but the box cutter wasn't long enough to cut them off. Not that Izuku really wanted to do that anyway. If he cut them off, would they grow back? Or were they like an arm that once it was severed, was gone forever? He really needed to stop getting distracted by interesting quirks because just as he was getting into a rhythm fighting the tentacle villain, another came up and hit him between the shoulder blades, throwing him to the ground and making him lose his hold on the box cutter. He looked up to see a villain with bulging muscles looming above him. This wasn't good. Well, he didn't have any ranged weapons, but his best option was the dowels, probably, since he'd lost his knife. Izuku's heart sunk as he grabbed the wooden sticks from his hoodie pocket. They didn't look like they'd do a lot of good against a strength quirk. The man lunged for him again and Izuku dodged around him, then brought both sticks down on the back of the man's skull. They broke. Oh! Izuku gulped as the man slowly turned around and glared at him. This was it. This was how he died. Wait, was he deflating? I thought I told you to get away, kid. Suddenly the man was wrapped in Eraserhead's scarf and pulled out of the way to reveal the hero himself staring down at Izuku with an exasperated expression. This was how he died. Sorry, Eraserhead, sir. I just... A movement behind Eraserhead caught Izuku's eye and he realized that the tentacle villain hadn't been taken down yet and was going to grab Eraserhead. Izuku didn't even have time to think before he was rushing forward. His dowels may be broken, but they had splintered when they broke, which made them more like stakes. He didn't need to completely defeat the villain, he just needed to immobilize him for long enough for Eraserhead to erase his quirk. He ducked beneath Eraserhead's arm and brought his stakes down on two of the tentacles, pinning them to the ground and making the villain cry out in pain. A few seconds later, the man was dragged toward him as his tentacles retracted back into his head. Izuku looked up behind him and could barely see a glint of red behind the gold goggles. Eraserhead waited a few seconds to make sure that the villain wasn't getting up. He must have passed out from the pain once his quirk was erased, then turned his glare toward Izuku. You must be Viridian. Izuku winced. I didn't ask for that article, I swear. I'm so sorry, Eraserhead. I was going to get Amplifier when these guys just started going crazy all of a sudden. But then one of them saw me, and then I... Wait, did you say they went crazy all of a sudden? Izuku nodded and shrunk a little when he saw the scowl deepen on Eraserhead's face. He watched as Eraserhead knelt down and turned the tentacle villain over onto his back, then opened his mouth and took out his tongue. Figures. Why is the color of his tongue important, Eraserhead? Izuku asked hesitantly. Couldn't it just be a part of his quirk? Don't some species of squid naturally have black tongues? Eraserhead looked up at him appraisingly. True, but why don't you check one of the other villains? I doubt you can justify them all having black tongues naturally. Izuku slowly made his way over to one of the unconscious villains and looked at his tongue. Sure enough, it was black, but the color's fading. Eraserhead nodded. It's the drag. It's called trigger. You can tell who's addicted because the tongue stays black. These guys must have just shot up the one time. But they didn't shoot up. Izuku said. Eraserhead froze. What? Izuku fidgeted under his stare. I was watching them. They weren't using needles or anything before they went crazy. They weren't even smoking. Eraserhead frowned. Strange. Eraserhead, sir? Izuku fidgeted again. I'm sorry for getting in your way. Eraserhead sighed. Just call me Eraser, kid, and while I wish you'd hadn't gotten involved, you managed to hold your own. Stay out of fights, kid, you don't want to die. Izuku waited for probably a moment too long before nodding and running away. Izuku tucked himself back into bed after tending to his injuries for the night and thought about those weird thugs. Eraser said it was some kind of a drag, but how did they get exposed to it? Izuku shook his head. He should leave the investigation to Eraser and the police, he would just get in the way. Right as he was falling asleep, he remembered what one of the thugs had said right before going crazy. There are flies everywhere. Weren't flies supposed to be asleep at night? Izuku had never actually been to a hardware store before. It probably had something to do with growing up without a father, but Mom had always just hired a handyman for anything that needed to be fixed around the house, and that guy always brought his own materials. So Izuku had never really had any reason to walk inside a store like this before, which was why he was currently standing frozen at the entrance, unsure of where to begin. Some of the employees were starting to stare at him strangely, probably wondering why a kid in a middle school uniform was staring at their store like it was some kind of labyrinth that was going to eat him alive. So Izuku forced his feet to move and started aimlessly wandering while trying to look discreetly at the signs. It wasn't his fault the store was so big and intimidating. All right, he'd had a goal when he'd walked in here, hadn't he? All right, pipe. After the fight with those drugged-up villains last week, he decided that he needed to not fine-tune his weapon selection. The dowels had worked great for the first few seconds, but they broke far too easily, and just because Mom hadn't realized they were missing from the closet yet didn't mean he could just keep taking them until they were gone. What if Mom wanted to use them for another project? So, anyway, pipe hopefully wouldn't break as easily and it shouldn't be that hard to buy, right? But what section was he supposed to? Plumbing sounded promising. Plumbing used pipes, didn't it? Izuku fought to not facepalm at his own stupidity, since he didn't need to give the staff any more reasons to question his sanity. Of course plumbing used pipes. He really was as stupid as Kaken said, wasn't he? He turned down the aisle and started looking around while desperately trying to pretend he knew what he was doing. Why were there so many pipes? And why were they all so long? He wasn't looking for a quarterstaff, he wanted something he could fit in his pocket. Finally he found some copper pipe that looked short enough to be promising. He picked up a piece and started passing it between his hands. It was light but felt comfortable enough. Is there anything I can help you with? Izuku yelped and dropped the pipe, which made a series of loud clanging sounds as it bounced on the floor. Izuku felt his face heat up and turned to the employee who was looking at him apologetically. The kid was around his own age and had yellow hair that was almost as bright as the red apron of his store uniform. Sorry about that, dude. The employee said. We're just supposed to offer help and expertise to the people who come in. Not that I actually have much expertise, I'm just a part-timer, but I could help you find someone who's an expert if you want. Izuku didn't think that any of the employees were experts in vigilantism. No thanks, I'm Jay, just browsing. If you tell me what your project is, I could probably point you in the right direction. The kid offered. It's just a hobby. Izuku glanced down at the copper pipe, which was still sitting forgotten on the floor. It seemed too conspicuous, like it was a physical reminder of how useless he was. He not only didn't know what kind of pipe to buy, but he'd also managed to loudly drop one within minutes of arriving at the store. He really was such an idiot, wasn't he? The employee followed his gaze downward and smiled sheepishly. Sorry, dude, normally I'd grab that and put it back for you, but, he chuckled awkwardly, I'm not really supposed to handle any conductive materials. For the first time, Izuku noticed the black lightning bolt pattern in the employee's hair. Oh, you have an electricity quirk. Yeah. The employee smiled brightly. My name's Kaminari, by the way. Nice to meet you. Izuku leaned down and picked up the pipe. It's really smart of you to work here with your quirk, I'm sure you're learning all sorts of stuff about circuits and electricity. Kaminari's eyes widened. Whoa, I hadn't even thought of that, dude. I just wanted to save some extra money for high school. I wonder if some of the guys in the electronics section would be willing to teach me. I'm sure they would. Izuku smiled. Good luck. Thanks, dude. Kaminari smiled. And good luck on your project. Izuku nodded and watched Kaminari leave before turning back to the pipe in his hands. He looked it over and frowned when he saw some small dents from where he dropped it. Copper was probably really good for traditional pipes, but it seemed like it was too soft for what Izuku had in mind. It would be really inconvenient to have to fix dents in his weapons every night. Which put him back to square one. If copper wasn't going to cut it, then what kinds of metal were there? There were a bunch of different plastics and PVC pipes, but those would probably have the same problems with breaking as the dowels did, so he didn't waste much time in that section. Finally, he saw a section with black pipes that said they were made of iron. He picked up a shorter piece and it seemed like it was heavy enough to pack a punch. He almost wanted to drop it to make sure it wouldn't dent, but the embarrassment had been bad enough the first time and that had been an accident. He chose 2 identical pieces that were thick enough for him to hold comfortably and around 30 centimeters long. They'd take some getting used to, but the store didn't sell anything shorter than that in the iron, so they'd have to do. He put his pipes in his basket and started wandering toward a sign that said tools. He probably wouldn't buy anything from there, but it wouldn't hurt to look right. Maybe they'd have a larger box cutter or something similar. The one he had was functional, but it hadn't been long enough to do any meaningful damage to that tentacle villain, so it'd be good to have something with a longer blade as a backup. Looking at the box cutters, though, Izuku realized that they didn't really have a lot of variety when it came to blade length. It seemed like most of the differences between different models were just the width and the handle, which wasn't something that Izuku cared about. Displayed right next to the box cutters, though, were a few utility knives. Izuku hesitated before looking at them. Was he really ready to carry a knife? That seemed more serious somehow. Like he was actually planning on hurting someone rather than just taking along a weapon in case of emergencies. But was a knife really all that different than a box cutter? They were both sharp and could do some damage, and the utility knife would be really useful. He gave in and got a generic-looking knife that was able to fold into its own handle so he wouldn't accidentally cut himself. It's not like he had to use it, right? It was just good to have. Between the knife and the pipes, though, Izuku was starting to get concerned about how he was going to carry everything. Sure, he had his hoodie pocket, but he'd already dropped his soup can 3 times while running and it had only been a week. Things just started to fall out from all the bouncing that running involved, so he should probably find a better solution. He wandered around the tool aisle a little longer before he saw a section labeled tool aprons. Some looked like actual aprons, like the kind Kaminari had been wearing, but others were more like utility belts. They had loops that were probably meant for hammers, but Izuku could easily modify them to hold his pipes, and some pockets that would probably be perfect for his knife and can. He chose one made out of a dark green canvas-like material that would match well with the rest of his vigilante outfit and added it to his basket. It was a little pricey, but he hadn't bought any hero merch since the point was that he had a little extra allowance saved up, so he could afford it. Izuku made his way toward the checkout section, but stopped when one of the displays on the end of the aisles caught his attention. Slingshots. Well, it would be nice to have something capable of long-range attacks. He gave into temptation and read the packaging. Slingshots, a fun, effective tool perfect for hunting and survival. Simply put your preferred ammunition, we recommend steel shot, marbles, or even smooth rocks, in the leather pouch and fire. There were some packages of steel shot in the same display, which basically looked like metal marbles, but Izuku didn't grab any. Firing metal at someone sounded really serious, like firing a bullet, and he really wasn't a serious vigilante. Besides, other people were probably a lot better at slingshots than he was, and if they were planning on using them for hunting or survival, then they needed the professional ammunition much more than he did. The cashier gave Izuku a weird look as he checked out, but he wasn't really paying attention. He should buy some marbles on the way home. They'd be perfect for his slingshot, plus, they'd solve a problem he'd been having finding rocks. Normally there was enough rubble from past hero fights that Izuku didn't have any trouble finding stuff to throw to get heroes' attention, but there had been a few times when it had taken a minute or two to find something to throw and the heroes had almost been too late. If he had marbles to throw, he wouldn't have to waste any time finding rocks. He wouldn't use his slingshot on the heroes, that'd be rude, but throwing them would work fine. He chose a bigger toy store downtown, hoping they'd have a bigger variety of marbles. Thankfully, he didn't get nearly as many odd looks here, but it did feel weird to be here. Without making a beeline for the hero collectibles aisle. It took him a few minutes to find the marbles, but when he did, he was glad he'd come here rather than a smaller store. There were a lot of marbles that were sold in small net bags that had 10 or so normal marbles and a larger one, but what made Izuku grin was the large dispensers that sold marbles in bulk. He grabbed one of the canvas bags and looked at the different colors. Whoever was in charge of naming marble colors should help students come up with their hero names, because they were obviously having way too much fun with their job if the crazy names like Tsunami or Wild Tiger were any indication. Izuku finally settled on a color called Enchanted Forest, which was a swirling mix of dark green and black, because it matched his vigilante outfit, and he bought about 2 pounds worth of marbles. Hopefully that would be enough to last him at least a couple of weeks, and there were a few pockets on his new tool belt that would be perfect for them. For the first time since he'd met All Might, Izuku walked home smiling. Izuku kept an eye on the clock and put all his books away 5 minutes before school ended. He saw some of the other students shooting him looks as the seconds ticked away and swallowed thickly. Hopefully he really had been getting faster since becoming a vigilante because he wasn't looking forward to what would happen to him if he didn't manage to get away in time. The bell was like the gun at the beginning of a race, and Izuku was out of the room before most of his classmates had even grabbed their bags. From there, it was just rushing to his locker, then out the door. The only one who could even hope to catch up to him at this point would be Kaken, but Izuku hoped that his luck would hold and Kaken would just go home like he'd been doing for the last few weeks. He didn't know why Kaken seemed to be taking it easy on him, but maybe he'd finally realized that Izuku didn't have any hope of being better than him. Maybe if Izuku kept his head down, then Kaken wouldn't see him as a threat and he'd keep leaving him alone. It was almost too much to hope for. Mom was at work when he got home, so he sent her a quick text saying that he was going to go watch hero fights as he got changed, then grabbed his slingshot and a few dozen marbles and walked out the door. He needed to get used to his new weapon, considering he'd never actually used a slingshot before, and it might just be his poor self-esteem talking, but somehow he didn't think that the middle of a fight was the best time to practice his aim. Hence why he was going to do some target practice. His first thought was to go to a park, but he didn't want to risk running into any of his classmates. They tried to destroy his things on the best of days, but if they were to see him practicing with a weapon, well, Izuku didn't want to have to go back to the hardware store so soon. Besides, it was probably better to practice someplace secluded anyway, because if people saw him practicing with a slingshot and then Viridian started using a slingshot shortly after, then that might be suspicious enough to lead the police to his doorstep, and he'd rather not make Mom worry. So, parks were out. He could go to the woods where he used to play with Kaken, but he didn't really know if Kaken still hung out there after school, and he'd really rather stay off his radar right now, so he couldn't go to the woods. That, of course, left the beach. Dagoba Beach definitely wasn't as pretty as it had been a few decades ago, but that wasn't really the beach's fault, just like it wasn't Izuku's fault that he was useless. It was just kinda a fact of life. Izuku had been introduced to it a few years ago when he'd tagged along with Kaken and his friends for an afternoon and they'd walked by it. Hey, that's where you should live, Deku. You'd feel right at home with all the other trash. He'd kinda been right. Yeah, the beach didn't smell the best since the weird fishy smell of the ocean mixed with the rotting piles of garbage, but the ventilation was okay, so it only took a few minutes for Izuku to stop noticing the smell, but it was secluded and peaceful. There wasn't anyone here to beat him up or tell him to kill himself, it was just him and all the other useless garbage that people had thrown away. It was nice. Izuku dug through the piles before he found a piece of sheet metal that wasn't too rusted and set it up against an old washing machine, then stood a few meters back and got out his slingshot. It took him a few tries to figure out how to pinch the marble through the pouch so that he didn't drop it, but soon enough he'd lined up his shot and aimed for the dead center of his makeshift target. Izuku took a deep breath and let go. Now, if he was right, the marble should make a sound when it hit the target and, well, either his target didn't actually make a sound or he'd missed. Of those two possibilities, Izuku had to admit that the latter was much more likely. He looked in the sand under the target, but couldn't see the marble, so his aim was obviously a bit off. He searched for a full 2 or 3 minutes before giving up and searching for a tarp to put behind his target instead. He didn't want the trash piles to eat all his marbles before he even had the chance to practice. Eventually, Izuku found a tarp that didn't have too many holes in it and draped it between his target and the washing machine, then put down another tarp on the sand underneath it. Okay, now as long as he managed to shoot in the general area of the target, he shouldn't lose his marbles. Not that he hadn't obviously lost his marbles a long time ago, considering he'd chosen to become a vigilante, so, dumb joke, he really should stop trying to be funny. He still didn't hit the target on his next shot, but the tarp worked well and caught the marble so he could reuse it. His arms were starting to get sore by the time he finally heard the telltale metallic ding as he hit the target for the first time, and Izuku couldn't help himself as he whooped in excitement and started jumping around, startling a few seagulls that had been trying to find something to eat among the garbage. He flushed with embarrassment before he realized that no one would be annoyed at him for yelling because no one was around, and then he smiled. He'd done it. He'd actually hit the target. By the time the sun was setting, Izuku was able to reliably hit his target and the sheet metal was covered in small dents. He was down a few marbles from when his shots had gone wildly off course, but overall, Izuku thought that the afternoon had been a success. He felt all warm and happy, and if he didn't know any better, he'd almost say that he was proud. If this was how Kaken felt every time someone told him how awesome he was, then Izuku could see the appeal. Katsuki didn't know how he was supposed to feel. He really shouldn't pity Deku. And he definitely shouldn't feel guilty for how he treated him. The quirkless fucker deserved it for being so weak, right? So then why did Katsuki feel like he was going to throw up every time one of those extras at school told him to jump off a roof? He'd told Deku to jump off a roof. It should be any different if someone else was saying it. But that was Deku really as weak as all that? When all those heroes had been sitting on their buttes, Deku had been the only one to run forward to try and save him. Did that mean that Deku was strong? Or did it mean that Katsuki was weak? Was he even weaker than Deku if he had to rely on a quirkless weakling like that to save him? He had to be strong. He had a quirk that let him make FANG expose ions. He was going to be the #1 hero and there was no way Deku or any of those other useless extras were going to stand in his way. He was going to be even better than All Might, but would All Might treat Deku like he had? But all his teachers knew that he was going to be a hero, and they would have told him if he wasn't acting like a hero, right? They were always going on about how Katsuki had what it took, and heroes were better than everyone else, so he was better than Deku, right? So why did he feel so bad? At first he just thought that sludge must have just been making him nauseous or something because there was no logical reason for him to feel this way. He was strong, he obviously wasn't doing anything wrong. But what if he was? Katsuki threw off the covers and went to his computer. He obviously wasn't going to be getting any sleep anytime soon, he might as well do something productive. He found himself looking up how to be a hero. There were obviously the articles that he'd read a million times before about how to apply to hero schools, what it took to get a license and all that crap, but that wasn't what Katsuki was really looking for. He frowned before typing something else into the search bar. How is a hero supposed to act? He clicked on a video of All Might and rushed to put the headphones in so that he wouldn't wake up his dad. The hag slept like a rock, so he wasn't worried about her. The interview was a few years old, and All Might grinned as he sat across from the host, the couch sagging under the weight of his massive muscles. The host looked like a baby in comparison, but it was always possible they were smaller than normal because of their quirk. So, All Might, I know that a lot of kids dream of being a hero like you. The host began. As well they should. All Might laughed. It's a difficult career, and it's definitely not for everyone, but if you have what it takes, it is extremely rewarding. Exactly. And we all know how physically grueling heroism can be, but what about emotionally? All Might, what do you think it takes to be a hero at heart, even for those that will never get a license? That's a good question. All Might paused for a moment as if he was thinking. I think a hero is someone who gives others hope. They lift others up at every opportunity and encourage them to be better. The people we heroes defend will almost always be weaker than we are, If this wasn't the case, then everyone would defend themselves and heroes wouldn't be the essential career they are today, but it is our responsibility to make sure they find their inner strength and become the best people they can be. What about heroes like Endeavor, who have been known to look down on their fans? I can't speak for every hero, of course, but I personally wouldn't have gotten to the #1 spot if I spent my time and energy insulting my fans. Katsuki froze as All Might turned to look at the camera, and it felt like he was staring right into his soul. A hero isn't someone who insults others. A hero is kind and comforts people in the midst of disasters. My mentor once taught me that if a person is in need of saving, that means they are going through the worst day of their lives. If you insult them rather than saving them with a smile, are you really, truly saving them? Or are you making the worst day of their lives even worse? That's why I believe a hero should always strive to be kind, make others happy, and give them hope. That is what truly makes a hero. The interviewer laughed and moved on to the next question as the studio audience applauded the nation's symbol of peace, and Katsuki was left to stare at his reflection in the screen as it went dark as the next video in the playlist loaded. Crap. Shoyuta had never really understood the appeal of bars. He supposed that Yamada or Shirakumo probably would have dragged him along when they got old enough if they had actually started their own agency like they'd always planned, but Shoyuta just thought it was irrational to dull his senses with alcohol and loud music when there was work that needed to be done. Which was what brought him here, overlooking the bar district while partiers enjoyed the nightlife. Amplifier had only been out sick for a day or two, but since the last trigger incident had been in her territory, Shoyuta had asked for her permission to stick around and look for any leads. He'd been hanging around for almost 2 weeks and, while he'd managed to find a few small dealers, there hadn't been another major incident. Shoyuta heard Amplifier's voice echoing from a few streets over, and he sighed and started running in that direction. It was probably nothing she couldn't handle, but he may as well lend a hand as long as he didn't have any of his own leads to chase. As he got closer to the fight, however, he almost stopped in shock. He wasn't the only one who had shown up to the fight. Crouching on the rooftop, eyes glued to the fight below, was Viridian. The kid had a small notebook out, and Shoyuta wondered how he could even see what he was writing in the sparse light. It couldn't be good for his eyes. He could see the kid's lips moving as well, so he was probably muttering something, but the words were drowned out by the sound of Amplifier's quirk. The kid had also gotten some more gear, apparently, which alleviated some of Shuta's worries that Viridian wouldn't be able to defend himself. He had added a belt to his costume, which held his tin can and a couple that sticks. Hopefully they were more durable than the ones he tried to use last time Shoyuta had run into him. There was also a slingshot hanging from one of the loops, and Shoyuta nodded in satisfaction. At least the kid had enough sense to cover his long-range defenses. He decided he'd watched long enough, he should get Viridian to give him an overview of the situation, since he'd most likely been the one to lead Amplifier to the fight in the first place. Does she need any help? Viridian yelped and clutched his notebook to his chest as he turned around with panic in his eyes. Shoyuta snorted, "Seriously, kid? I would think a vigilante would have more situational awareness. How do you manage to sniff out crimes as well as you do if you couldn't even tell I was behind you?" Eraserhead, sir. You are one of the most stealth-based heroes out there, and Amplifier's quirk is based on volume, so you probably used her quirk to cover your own approach. Unless that's not what you were trying to do, but then again, I guess I was kinda distracted watching the fight and… Shoyuta rolled his eyes as he went to the edge of the roof and looked down. Amplifier had stopped yelling and seemed to be comforting the victim as a group of thugs struggled weakly on the ground. "You lead her to this one?" Viridian nodded frantically. "The guys were drunk and I didn't want them to hurt that girl because she was alone and I really didn't like the way they were looking at her and…" Shoyuta cut off the kid's rambling. "Good work, kid." Viridian gave him a bright smile, like Shoyuta had congratulated him on saving the world rather than just one girl, and practically started vibrating with excitement. Thank you, Eraserhead, sir." "Like I said before, kid, it's just Eraser." "Oh." Viridian's face fell and Shoyuta hoped he was imagining the glimmer of tears behind his goggles. "I am sorry, Eraser." "It's not a big deal, kid." Seriously, he hadn't been expecting Viridian to be so emotional. What was up with the kid? He hadn't actually done anything wrong. Well, he hadn't if Shoyuta ignored the whole vigilante thing, but there was nothing actually wrong with calling him by his full hero name. So why had a simple correction been enough to move the kid to tears? Maybe he should change the subject. So, what were you writing? Viridian quickly hid the notebook in one of the pouches on his belt. Oh, nothing? Shoyuta shot him an unimpressed look. Really, kid? If you're going to lie, at least come up with a better excuse. Let me see. It's really nothing. Shoyuta raised one eyebrow. It's just .my notes are silly and kinda embarrassing. Viridian finally muttered. It's just some thoughts on the fight so I can figure out what Amplifier was doing and maybe do something similar in the future. I mean, it's nothing special, I know it's kinda creepy. Shoyuta raised an eyebrow at him. You're learning by example, that's smart. I wish my students had half that drive. Viridian's head snapped up and he looked at Shoyuta with wide eyes. You're a teacher? Shoyuta snorted. Yeah, I expel brats at you. Maybe if you actually stay off the streets, you could actually be in my class in a few years. Viridian looked at the ground and started fidgeting with the sleeves of his hoodie. Do you teach the Hero Corps students? Yes, Shoyuta looked at Viridian curiously. I teach the first years. Then I won't be in your class. Viridian shook his head. I can't be a hero. Why? Bye, Eraser. See you later. Viridian started scrambling down the fire escape even though the roofs were close enough together that it'd be easier for him to parkour away. Shoyuta thought fast and wrapped his capture weapon around one of Viridian's wrists. He stopped and Shoyuta could feel how hard he was trembling just from the way his capture weapon moved. Kid, do you not know parkour? Parkour. Shoyuta rolled his eyes. Yes, kid, parkour. You know, running across rooftops without dying? It's pretty essential in this line of work. Viridian had started fidgeting with his sleeves again as soon as Shoyuta released the tension on his weapon. I don't know. I mean, I guess I've considered it, but I've never really learned, so no? Shoyuta sighed. Follow me. He made his way down the fire escape, waving to Amplifier as they passed her and was pleased when he saw that Viridian had actually started following him. He really should be working on finding leads, but it didn't look like anyone else was going to put in the work to make sure this kid didn't die. It didn't take them long to reach a skate park a few streets over. It was practically abandoned at this time of night except for a few homeless people and drag dealers, but as long as they left each other alone, Shoyuta wasn't going to worry about them. He turned around, forcing Viridian to stop quickly to avoid running into him. Alright, first things first, you have to learn how to fall. I thought the point of parkour was to not fall. Shoyuta gave him a deadpan glare. No, the point is to not get hurt when you fall. You're always going to fall, especially early on, and that's why you have to start small. He gestured to the park. Places like this are a good place to practice early on because you don't have that far to fall. Tonight, though, I'm just gonna teach you how to roll. You're going to teach me? Shoyuta rolled his eyes. Yes, kid, I'm going to teach you. Why else would I have led you here? Viridian shrugged. Catch me? Shoyuta sighed again. Not tonight, kid. Little known fact is that we heroes, especially underground heroes like me, often prefer to work with vigilantes than against them. If you get overly violent or turn to villainy, that'll change pretty quickly, but for right now, we're good. Just don't tell the cops. They're a little more uptight about the whole thing. Alright, now like I said, you're always going to fall. Rolling is a good way to make sure that your momentum gets dissipated gradually so that it doesn't hurt your body. You don't get hurt by moving fast, you get hurt when you suddenly stop moving. That made Viridian chuckle, which Shoyuta decided to count as a win considering he'd made the kid cry earlier. We're not going to start from on top of a wall, you're not ready for that right now, but just watch me. Viridian cried out as Shoyuta dove toward the ground, tucking his arm under him so that he rolled over his shoulder and landed back on his feet. That's a basic roll. Now let's go slow and I'll talk you through it. Shoyuta spent the next hour coaching the kid on some of the basic movements of parkour and giving him some exercises that would give him a decent foundation. The kid was obviously unused to the movement, but he was a pretty fast learner, all things considered. Occasionally, Viridian would stop to adjust the tools on his belt so that the weight didn't get in his way, Or he would take out his notebook and write something down before putting it away again. Shoyuta couldn't help but be a little curious about it, even though the kid had told him it was nothing. You should take notes on villains too, Shoyuta said as Viridian reached for his notebook yet again after Shoyuta had taught him a new movement. Taking notes on heroes is good, so you can learn what they do, but knowing what villains do is arguably more important. Viridian finished writing what he was going to and put the notebook back in his belt. But you don't fight repeat villains all the time, and everyone has unique quirks. Why does it matter how a particular villain fights? Think about it, kid. Shoyuta sat down on one of the low walls and gestured for Viridian to sit next to him. Yeah, you might not ever come across that exact quirk again, but take present mic and amplifier. Their quirks might not be identical, but they're similar enough that what works against one might work against another, Viridian said slowly. So the more I understand different villains' quirks, the more strategies I'll be prepared to fight with. Shoyuta nodded. At least the problem child was quick on his feet. Not that Shoyuta didn't already know that, considering that he'd won his first fight with literal garbage. You'll also get better at looking for weaknesses. Right now, because you're trying to emulate heroes, you're automatically looking for people's strengths, when what you really need to be focusing on is their weaknesses. Viridian had pulled his notebook back out and was apparently taking notes on everything Shoyuta said. Now he really wished the kid was one of his students. Shoyuta glanced at his watch and stood. You'd probably better get to bed, kid. Don't you have school tomorrow? Whatever eagerness Viridian had been showing only moments before disappeared as the kid seemed to shrink in on himself, almost like he was trying to make himself a smaller target. Good night, Eraser. Thank you for your help. Sorry for bothering you. He almost stopped the kid from running off again, but by the time he realized Viridian was going to run, he was already around the corner. He knew the kid was fast, but seriously? He sighed and made his way back to the rooftops. He'd wasted some time, but he couldn't bring himself to regret it. After all, an extra set of boots on the ground couldn't hurt, right? How did Shoyuta get himself into these situations? There had been a trigger-enhanced next-level villain attack earlier that day, so he was doing the rounds, shaking down any trigger dealers he knew to try to get some leads while the police tried to figure out the poor guy's identity. The first few had been just what he expected, but this last one had shot up as soon as Aizawa started asking questions, and now he was trying to figure out how to lead this guy away from populated areas. And he was a mutant type, so there was that. The dealer had a crab-type heteromorphic quirk, which hadn't been a big deal when his skin was just a bit more durable and there was an extra pair of arms. But now his skin had hardened into an armored shell and his hands and turned into razor-sharp claws, and Shoyuta couldn't erase it. So far, he'd just been dodging all of the villain's attacks and waiting for the trigger to wear off. This batch must have been more potent than most, however, because they'd been doing this dance for 10 minutes now and the guy wasn't even out of breath. Sneak attacks were really much more effective, not that he couldn't do drawn-out battles, but he didn't prefer them for various reasons. One of those reasons being that the longer he fought, the more likely it was for him to blink and miss something important, such as one of the claws reaching out and tangling itself in his capture weapon. Within seconds, the crab villain had managed to spin his claws in such a way that Shoyuta was tangled in his own weapon and his hands were pinned to his side. Dang it. If he made it out of this alive, Tsukachi would never let him live this down. The villain was grinning down at him as he gradually tightened the weapon until Shoyuta couldn't breathe, then tightened it some more. Suddenly, Shoyuta felt something whiz by the top of his head and hit the villain right between his eyes, making him stagger back and loosen his hold on the capture weapon. Shoyuta gasped for air and tried to yank his capture weapon back, but the villain had already recovered. Swearing, he reached for his knife to cut the weapon right as his opponent moved to tighten the noose again. Suddenly, the villain cried out in pain and clutched his eyes. Shoyuta didn't waste any time cutting the weapon free of the villain's claws and stepping back to catch his breath. Now that he wasn't about to die, he glanced to the side to see who had helped him, only to see Viridian trembling beside him with his slingshot still at the ready. The kid's expression was frozen halfway between determined and terrified, a fact that Shoyuta probably would have laughed at in any other situation. "Get out of here, kid!" Shoyuta yelled. "This guy's on trigger, he's out of your league." Izuku knew that he should listen to Eraserhead. This guy was a lot bigger than most of the small fry he'd managed to take down alone. Even Eraser was having trouble with him. But that was exactly why Izuku knew that he couldn't leave. If he left, even if it was to go get another hero, then there was a chance that Eraserhead would be dead by the time he came back and he wouldn't be able to live with himself if that happened. Besides, it's not like he was taking a huge risk fighting this guy. Eraserhead would be able to save so many more people than Izuku could if he survived this fight, and he was a hero that would still be able to fight his way out even if the villain killed Izuku. That was why Izuku didn't hesitate to run forward, ignoring Eraser's yells behind him as he switched his slingshot out for his pipes. If only one of them could survive this fight, Izuku had to make sure it was Eraserhead and not a useless Deku like him. Izuku just hoped he could distract the villain long enough for Eraserhead to beat him. He'd been aiming for the villain's eyes to get him to let go of his victim earlier, but Izuku's aim wasn't very good yet and it had taken a few tries, which was why he decided to switch to close range. Besides, he didn't think his marbles would do much good against the villain's shell anyway. He didn't know if his pipes would do much better, but at least they were easier to aim. He tried to review what he knew about crabs as he got closer, but he couldn't think of any obvious weaknesses, except for maybe the joints. Even if the guy's skin was hardened into a shell, there had to be breaks in it so he could move around, and Izuku had had enough action figures break at the joints that he knew how fragile they were. He brought both pipes down on the bend of one of the villain's arms, hoping he was right, and had to duck quickly as one of the claws was aimed toward his head. He rolled just like Eraser had taught him to and got to his feet to see the arm he'd targeted hanging a little more limply. "Eraser! Aim for the joints!" He heard Eraser yelling something at him again, but focused on running forward again and hitting one of the villain's knees. If he could just decrease his mobility. He rolled away as the villain stumbled and he looked to see that Eraser had wrapped his capture weapon around one of the villain's arms and used that as leverage to slingshot himself and kick at the villain's hips. So cool. The only problem was that even though the villain had collapsed onto the ground from the combined force of both their attacks, he still had a solid hold on Eraser's capture weapon and was trying to tangle it around Eraser like he had been when Izuku arrived. Izuku dodged another hit from the villain's flailing arms and switched to his knife. He was still nervous to really use it, but it's not like he was actually using it on the villain, right? He just needed to cut the capture weapon so that Eraser could get free. He unfolded the blade and ran forward, trying to slash the cloth as close to the villain's arm as he could. It took a few passes, since the cloth must be mixed with some kind of metal, but Eraserhead had gotten out his own knife and together they managed to get him free. Izuku hesitated only a moment before tossing his pipes to Eraser, who caught them with a confused look on his face. "Your capture weapon isn't a good match for this villain. It's only gonna keep getting tangled." Izuku's eyes widened as he realized he'd just told the hero what to do. "Not that you have to use my pipes. I mean, you obviously know a lot better than I do and you've been doing this a lot longer and—" "Viridian, look out." Izuku only caught a glimpse of the freaked-out look on Eraser's face before the blunt part of one of the villain's claws hit him in the stomach and threw him hard against one of the walls. Good thing he'd already given Eraser his pipes. Shoyuta froze as he watched Viridian, a literal child, get batted against the wall and pass out. Or hopefully pass out. The kid was slumped over and had gone limp, but Shoyuta didn't know what he'd do if the kid was. He turned back to the villain with rage in his eyes, clutching the pipes Viridian had given him like a lifeline as he practically growled, "Big mistake." He ducked and dodged every attack the villain threw at him and used the pipes to bludgeon the joints. He wasn't used to fighting with them, but he had to admit that they were much more effective than his capture weapon against this particular villain. Within minutes, the villain collapsed in a pile on the floor and started to shrink down as the trigger finally wore off. Shoyuta texted Tsukachi to come pick the villain up and ran to help Viridian. "Kid, can you hear me?" Viridian groaned. "Eraserhead? Are you okay? Did you win?" Shoyuta looked at the kid in shock. "Am I okay? Am I okay? You just got thrown against a wall, problem child. You're lucky you didn't die." Viridian shrugged as he got to his feet. Shrugged. "Well, you beat the villain, didn't you? So it was worth it." Shoyuta opened and closed his mouth a few times as he tried to figure out how to respond to that. "No. Kid, that was stupid and reckless. Don't do that again. Okay. He didn't like the fact that he could tell Viridian was lying. If the kid kept putting himself in dangerous situations like this, which it sounded like he was going to, then he was going to get himself killed. Shoyuta needed to make sure that didn't happen. And he needed to make sure the kid was actually okay after that blow. Come on, I'm taking you to the hospital. The kid shook his head frantically, only to stop with a wince, which meant that the kid most likely had a headache and probably a concussion as well. All the more reason to get him medical attention. He grabbed onto the Viridian's arm, careful not to hold on too tight in case the kid was bruised there. No offense, problem child, but I'm not giving you a choice. You need a doctor. Viridian frowned, but stopped fighting and let Shoyuta start leading him down the street toward the nearest hospital. Shoyuta sighed with relief and tore his eyes away from the kid so he could see where they were going, which was why he missed the way the kid's arm wound up for a punch. The hit was sloppy, but Viridian actually managed to punch him right on the nose with a surprising amount of strength. Instinctively, his hands went to his face as his eyes watered, and by the time he'd recovered enough to see again, Viridian had already disappeared. DMN problem child. Shoyuta muttered as he made his way back to the downed villain. What am I gonna do? Izuku had to pause in the middle of putting on his school uniform as the weight of what he'd done last night came crashing down on him. He'd been too tired last night to really process what had happened, but now the panic was back with a vengeance. He'd punched Eraserhead. Eraser had to be so mad at him. He'd just been trying to get Izuku to a hospital, but then he'd panicked about what would happen if they figured out who he was, which meant that Mom would figure out what he'd been doing, and she would be so worried and scared, and he really didn't want to do that to her, so he had to get away. But if he wanted to get away, he had to make Eraser let go of him, and he really wasn't thinking that clearly, and the first stupid thought he'd had was to punch a hero in the nose. Whatever respect Eraser had for him was gone, not that he could have gained that much considering that Izuku was a quirkless middle schooler who couldn't even aim his slingshot correctly, but that didn't matter because it was gone now and he was never going to get it back. Good work, Deku, his inner Kaken said. You managed to F things up even worse than you usually do. He didn't want to have to face Eraserhead again. Maybe he would die before he had to see him. That would be good. Maybe he would go out tonight and there would be some villain attack, maybe even another trigger villain, and Izuku would just step in instead of getting a hero, and then it'd all be over quickly and he wouldn't have to deal with Eraser's anger, or Amplifier's disappointment, or Mom's worry, or Kaken's. Izuku shook his head forcefully. He wasn't supposed to be thinking things like that. Besides, with his luck that probably wouldn't work anyway. Even if everything went well and he died, the fact that he didn't go get a hero for such a big villain would be suspicious, and then what would happen if they realized he'd wanted to dot, and then they'd look into Kaken and he wouldn't be able to go to UA and it would all be Izuku's fault. Izuku shook his head again and winced as he realized he had a headache he'd been ignoring. His ribs hurt more than his head did though. He knew he probably had a little concussion, but it was nothing compared to that time Kachen had pushed him off the slide on accident and he'd hit his head, so Izuku wasn't that worried. He shrugged off his shirt so he could put some cream on his ribs, tensing as the cold cream hit his skin. After that, he finished getting dressed and grabbed his backpack. He didn't want to be late for school. Katsuki tuned out the extras that surrounded him as he ate his lunch. The old hag had packed the extra spicy curry today, so he knew it was gonna be good. Look guys, it's Deku. One of the extras at another table called out, and sure enough, Katsuki looked up to see Deku walking into the cafeteria with his shoulders hunched. The extras sitting at his table looked to see how he'd react, but he just scoffed and turned back to his lunch. Heroes didn't pick on their classmates, no matter how much they deserved it, and he was going to be the best hero. What's up, Deku? The extra with extendable fingers asked. Still alive. A small group of their classmates had surrounded Deku by this point, and even some of the extras at Katsuki's table had gotten up to go join the fun. The extras were grinning and laughing like Fingers had just made the funniest joke on earth, but Deku himself was just staring silently at the ground. Why so quiet? Another extra, this one with boulders for hair, asked. Finally realize that no one cares what you have to say? Well, that might be true, but it probably wasn't very nice to say. Katsuki knew he was acting like a bit of a hypocrite. It wasn't like anything they were saying to Deku was new. Katsuki himself had always prided himself on being especially creative with his insults. After all, so in comparison, these extras' insults were boring and almost as plain as Deku's face. So it wasn't like the extras were saying anything that Deku hadn't heard before, or anything they hadn't heard Katsuki himself say. But Katsuki wanted to be like All Might, which meant that he wasn't going to waste his time insulting people anymore. His classmates didn't have any hope of being heroes, though, so it was okay for them to insult Deku, right? Or was that wrong too? What would All Might do if he was here? Boulders had taken that moment to punch Deku in the ribs, making him gasp in pain. Either Boulders had gotten stronger or Deku had already had sore ribs. Had some of the other extras given him a beating when Katsuki wasn't looking? Thinking back, Deku had been walking kind of funny all day, like he was sore or something, and goodness knows that the nerd wasn't athletic enough to be sore from exercise. Hey, save some of that air for those who deserve it, nerd. Katsuki looked to some of the teachers who were eating at a small table in the corner. They had to know what was happening. It wasn't like those extras were being quiet. So why weren't they doing anything? Why hadn't they ever done anything? Wasn't it their job to keep kids from getting hurt or something? What would All Might do if he were one of them? He'd probably tell those kids off for being unheroic. But the teachers weren't doing that. Katsuki watched them as the extras kept insulting Deku, and one of them even glanced over and chuckled before turning back to his lunch. Well, it was normal, but it didn't seem right. Why wasn't anyone doing anything? Why wasn't he doing anything? The thought made Katsuki stop. Was he supposed to step in? All Might probably would, but that brought him back to the whole hypocrisy thing. What gave him the right to step in and protect Deku when just a month ago, he was one of the ones. Well, maybe attacking him wasn't the right way to phrase it, but still. Even if he were to step in, Deku probably wouldn't trust him at all, and all the useless extras might think that Katsuki was admitting that Deku was better than him, or that he was weak. The curry turned to sawdust in his mouth, spicy sawdust, but still flavorless as Deku silently picked the remains of his lunch off the floor and threw them away after one of the extras had knocked it out of his hands. He didn't really know how to describe what he was feeling, he just knew he didn't like it. He was the best, he'd always been the best, and if there was anything the best wasn't, it was a coward, so this annoying feeling couldn't be fear. Could it? Izuku walked through the hardware store much more confidently this time, now that he actually knew what he was looking for and how to find it. He should have just picked his pipes up when he left last night's fight, but even though the concussion hadn't been that bad, both it and the pain from being thrown into a wall had made it difficult to focus on anything. Besides getting away so Eraser wouldn't tell Mom about his vigilantism. Which meant that the pipes had been left to rot among all the other garbage in that alley and Izuku needed to replace them. He couldn't bring himself to regret giving them to Eraser though. If he'd kept using his capture weapon, there was a good chance he would have gotten hurt, so the pipes were obviously the better option. Not that Eraser's capture weapon was bad. It was actually really cool and worked against a lot of villains so that he didn't hurt them any more than he had to and… Oh right, Izuku was here to get pipes. He should probably buy a few backups to keep in his closet too, just in case he ever lost them again. Yeah, that'd be a good idea. And zip ties. It wasn't a big problem when he helped heroes, but Izuku had been having problems restraining the small-time villains he was able to take down on his own. Most of the time he was able to find some kind of rope or cloth to tie them up with, but it would be nice to not have to worry about that anymore. Izuku was extremely proud of himself when he managed to get to the checkout stand with only the items on his list, unlike last time when he'd ended up with a lot of other stuff too. To his surprise, his cashier was the kid with the electricity quirk he'd talked to last time. What was his name again? Oh right, Kaminari. Hey dude. Kaminari smiled as Izuku put his basket down on the counter. Nice to see you back here. Thanks. Izuku said. How is your electricity training coming? Were any of the electricians willing to teach you? Kaminari nodded eagerly. One of them actually offered to make a temporary apprentice. I'm learning all about the basics and how circuits work and stuff. I didn't even realize that my quirk might not be effective against a flying villain. Isn't that insane? Izuku nodded. That was one of the main limitations of electric heroes. They couldn't actually electrocute something that wasn't grounded. But the way that he talked about villains specifically, are you going to be a hero? Kaminari shrugged and smiled. That's the hope. My quirk is flashy enough for it, so it's just a question of if I'm actually smart enough to get in. Cash or card? Izuku smiled encouragingly as he handed over a handful of cash. You can do it. Kaminari put the pipes and zip ties in a plastic bag. Thanks, dude. I'm sure gonna try. Hey, what are you making anyway? You were buying pipes last time. Izuku didn't know how to respond to that, so he just shrugged. Kaminari laughed. Alright, keep your secrets, dude. Good luck with whatever it is though. Izuku nodded. And good luck with your apprenticeship. See you later. Izuku had never really been lucky. In fact, he'd been mostly the opposite, but he was grateful for Kaminari's words anyway. He'd run into Eraserhead eventually, and then he'd need all the luck he could get. Izuku hesitated before grabbing a marble out of the pouch on his belt. Why couldn't Amplifier be closer? Or even Rocklock? He could have dealt with that. But why did it have to be Eraserhead? Izuku instinctively looked back even though the mugging he'd come across was a few streets away. Maybe he'd be able to handle it on his own, that he could just go back, but there were 5 big guys and the victim didn't look like he'd be able to run away fast enough if Izuku were to die, which was likely considering he was still injured from his fight last night. Izuku groaned in frustration, then threw the marble, which bounced off Eraserhead's back. Izuku's jaw dropped at his reflexes as Eraser whipped around and immediately grabbed the marble out of the air before it could hit the ground. He looked at it for a second in confusion before looking around. Izuku winced as he saw the ugly bruise spreading across Eraser's nose. He was such a bad person. He froze as Eraser's eyes zeroed in on him, but his expression was strange. Eraser should be really angry, and Izuku had been expecting a scowl like Kaken had when Izuku annoyed him, but instead Eraser looked relieved? It must just be because Izuku couldn't see his eyes, or he was just terrible at reading facial expressions because there was no way that someone would be relieved to see the person who punched them in the nose. Eraser must just be hiding his anger. Izuku smiled apologetically and started running. This was so embarrassing. Eraser probably wanted nothing to do with him, and yet here he was asking for help from someone who he'd hurt. He didn't deserve Eraser's help. He'd just have to stick around and help with the fight so Eraser didn't have to work as hard. He couldn't just punch him in the face, then expect him to do all the work. When they reached the mugging, Izuku ran right in, Eraserhead close behind him. The thugs were big, and at least 2 of them seemed to have minor strength enhancement quirks, so Izuku should try to handle the others first. He rushed toward a skinny guy who was manifesting short blades from his skin. He would probably get cut a few times, but it was better he got hurt than Eraserhead. He probably deserved some extra pain after what he'd done. Suddenly, the blades disappeared and Izuku glanced behind him to see Eraser glaring at his villain. Viridian, you have a slingshot for a reason. Don't just run in recklessly. Izuku's eyes widened. He was right, he'd bought his slingshot so he didn't have to get close to villains if he didn't have to. And Eraserhead had had to cancel the knife villain's quirk to remind him of that, which meant that he wasn't able to worry about the others, which meant that Izuku had messed everything up again. Nice going, Deku. He quickly got out of the knife quirk user's range and jumped on top of the dumpster so he had a good view of the fight, then got out his slingshot and a handful of marbles. He started pelting all 5 thugs with as many marbles as he could without hitting Eraserhead. Mostly he just distracted the villains. Long enough for Eraserhead to get a hit in, which honestly worked pretty well. It had only been a few minutes and Eraser had already managed to put 2 thugs out of commission. He was so cool. Eraserhead was focused on fighting the 2 strength quirk villains and Izuku was focused on creating an opening for Eraser, so neither of them noticed one of the thugs literally melt into the shadows and make his way to the dumpster Izuku was standing on. Izuku screamed and almost lost his balance when a creepy smile suddenly popped into existence in front of him, but before he could fall, the shadow villain grabbed his arm and flipped Izuku over his shoulder, slamming him hard onto the concrete. Izuku grit his teeth as he forced himself to roll to his feet like Eraser had taught him and grabbed his pipes. He lowered himself into a battle stance as he tried to keep his eye on the villain, but he simply melted into the shadows again, then popped up behind Izuku and kicked him in the back. This fight really wasn't good for his still bruised ribs. Izuku ran through what he knew about the guy's quirk. Okay, so he could blend in with shadows. Was he using it as a disguise to make himself invisible, or was he actually changing the shape of his body? Maybe he was using it to teleport? As the villain started to disappear again, Izuku ran forward and grabbed at the air. The villain was still there, he simply became invisible in darkness. Izuku grinned and closed his eyes. If he couldn't rely on his sense of sight, he'd just have to use his other senses. Kaken's explosions could get bright enough to temporarily blind someone, and he'd gone through a phase in elementary school where his favorite pastime was to blind Izuku during recess, then have his lackeys attack him while he couldn't see. Izuku had to learn to dodge based only on sound and movement, and eventually he'd gotten good enough at it that Kaken decided the game was too boring and he'd stopped. Izuku just hoped he wasn't too out of practice. Izuku took a deep breath. He could hear Eraser fighting those other two villains a little farther away, but let that fade into the background. He only needed to worry about the sounds closest to him. There was a footstep off to his left and a slight breeze by his shoulder, so Izuku leaned right and felt the punch fly past him. He could do this. There were a few more steps, then a change in air pressure on his other side, so he dodged again. The next punch came quicker, since the villain was probably trying to be unpredictable, but Izuku ducked so that the punch only knocked his hood off rather than breaking his nose. The next punch was on his left again, but it was eerily similar to Kaken's right hook, so Izuku was ready. He grabbed the man's arm and yanked as hard as he could, imitating the way Amplifier moved her feet when she judo flipped villains. He opened his eyes to see the guy lying dazed on the ground, so Izuku hurried to flip him over onto his stomach and zip-tie his hands behind him before he could disappear again. He'd done it. He'd taken him down. Shoyuta was freaking out. He'd heard Viridian scream a few minutes ago, but he couldn't afford to take his eyes off the two villains he was fighting. He just had to hope the kid would be alright. Viridian had been doing this for 2 months now, he knew enough not to die. It was just a question about whether he would actually use what he knew. DMN problem child. But for right now, Shoyuta had his own problems to worry about. These two couldn't do too much in the short time that it took to blink, but he still needed to end this quickly. He used his capture weapon to grab one and toss him into the other, but that one was sturdy enough that he just grunted, then threw another punch. Shoyuta jumped into the air to dodge, and flipped to land behind the guy without ever taking his eyes off him, a trick he'd perfected in high school. He managed to kick him in the kidneys, but by that time, the first one was back on his feet and swinging for Shuta's face too fast for him to dodge. Shoyuta flinched, but before the hit could land, the villain was hit on the side of the head with a soup can and went down. Shoyuta glanced back to see Viridian standing there with that same half-determined, half-terrified expression he'd had during their last fight together, having obviously just thrown the can. In the split second Shoyuta watched, Viridian grabbed his slingshot, which had somehow ended up on the ground, and drew it back. Duck! Shoyuta didn't hesitate to comply, and a second later, a marble shot over his head and he heard the final villain swear. He turned and shot his capture weapon out in one fluid movement, catching the still swearing villain by surprise. He wrapped the weapon around the man's ankle and launched him into the wall, then grabbed him by the hair and hit his head against the wall to knock him out. When that was done, Shoyuta looked around frantically to make sure Viridian was alright, only to find him already comforting the victim. Shoyuta looked around the alley and took stock of the situation. In addition to a zip-tied villain that Viridian must have taken down, the floor was littered with marbles, and that was that Viridian's notebook? Shoyuta glanced over at Viridian, who was now making sure the victim called the police. It must have fallen out of the problem child's pocket sometime during the fight. He picked the notebook up and, against his better judgment, started leafing through it. So he was curious, sue him. There were diagrams notating different fighting styles along with what heroes used them, and Shoyuta smiled fondly when he realized that the kid had been trying to imitate some of his moves as well. He kept reading and was pleased to find that the kid had started focusing on villain analysis recently. He didn't recognize most of the villains Viridian had written about, so he didn't bother to read carefully, but there was one entry about a villain Amplifier arrested a week or so ago that caught his eye. She'd been complaining about how hard it was because the guy's quirk let him see through solid objects, a skill he'd been using to peek inside women's restrooms in the bars he visited. He'd managed to hide from her for a good while because he'd just hide behind something so she couldn't see him, but he'd always been able to see her coming. Eventually, Viridian had apparently led her to him, but the whole chase had lasted several hours. Viridian's notes were mostly stream of consciousness, and his handwriting got messier the faster he wrote, so it took a few moments for Shoyuta to get used to the style and figure out what the notes said, but when he did, whoa. Guy seems to be an emitter type. Always runs away moments before Amplifier finds him, like he already knows she's coming. Some type of premonition quirk? Probably not, those are super rare and highly regulated. If someone like that were a villain, the government would know and warn the public. That's what they've done before when it's happened. So other possibilities? Maybe he sees her coming? Some remote vision quirk? How did he get caught in a chase then? Limit? He doesn't seem to run until she's right around the corner, so X-ray vision? Then that there must be objects he can't see through .lead? Impractical. But if he's looking through objects, then he won't think to look up. Thinking back, Amplifier had said she was surprised because Viridian led her over the rooftops to find the peeping Tom. Had he done that specifically to counteract the man's quirk? He'd managed to figure out the villain's quirk and how to work around it just from watching what he did, without knowing anything about him beforehand. That was amazing. Shoyuta went back and started reading some of the other analyses more carefully. If he'd thought that the peeping Tom analysis was the exception to the rule, he'd been wrong. Every analysis showed similar depth and thought, and could easily rival a professional analysis skill, even if Viridian's weren't as polished. Shoyuta had been assuming that Viridian had a mild speed quirk, but from what he'd read so far, an analysis quirk was more likely, and a powerful one at that. Eraserhead, sir? Shoyuta looked up to see Viridian staring at the notebook in his hands. Well, he may as well let the kid know what he thought, since he'd already been caught. These analyses are pretty impressive, kid. To his surprise, rather than accepting the praise, Viridian shook his head. No, they're not. I just write things down so I don't forget them. It's not like I'm writing anything special. Shuta's eyebrows shot up. You don't think this is anything special? Kid, you figure out people's quirks and how to beat them within minutes. Viridian shook his head again. Anyone can do that. They're just smart enough that they don't have to write it down to remember it. I'm not smart like them. Shoyuta frowned. From what he'd read, the kid was probably a genius, so he must be joking when he said he wasn't smart. Unless that, but Viridian's self-esteem couldn't be that bad, could it? Don't kid yourself, problem child. He held up the book. I wish my students were half this smart. Viridian fidgeted for a moment before suddenly snatching the notebook out of Shuta's hands and running off. Shoyuta groaned and considered chasing after him, but some of the villains were already starting to wake up and the police would be arriving any moment. DMN, problem child. Izuku was already a few blocks away by the time he stopped to catch his breath. He'd have to be more careful with his notebook. That was so embarrassing. Eraser had to lie and call him smart just to be polite, even though he'd probably been creeped out by Izuku's stupid ramblings just like his classmates were. Because there was obviously no way he actually believed Izuku was smart, right? But Eraserhead also didn't really care about politeness and social norms, so he wouldn't lie just to be polite. But he also hadn't seemed as angry as Izuku expected, considering that he had a bruise from when. Dang it. Izuku muttered. I forgot to apologize. Shoyuta couldn't help playing with the marble Viridian had thrown at him earlier as he sat by Tsukachi's desk after his shift. The kid was smart, making the marbles pull triple duty as a way to call heroes, ammo, and a sort of makeshift signature. Viridian would be a popular and effective hero if he'd just get off the streets and into a hero program, but first, he'd have to learn how to take better care of himself, because he really shouldn't be on the streets the night after he was almost killed. The kid must have an insane pain tolerance to be out and fighting so soon. The only indication that Viridian had been injured at all was a moderately slower running speed and a slight stiffness when he twisted, but he hadn't let it hold him back as he fought. Shoyuta didn't know if Viridian had broken his ribs, or just bruised them, but the kid shouldn't be so used to working through the pain. He also shouldn't be used to hiding his injuries. Shoyuta wasn't even sure the problem child had been doing it consciously, because the way the kid had been doing it instinctively, like pretending he was fine, was a habit he'd developed after years of practice. And wasn't that concerning? Viridian's obviously high pain tolerance and tendency to hide his injuries were just the latest entries in a disturbingly long list of concerns that Shoyuta had about the kid. He ran straight into danger when the most intelligent thing to do was run away, and if there was one thing Shoyuta knew, it was that Viridian wasn't stupid. He'd known the kid was smart just from the way he'd memorized everyone's patrol routes, and that intelligence had only been confirmed by the way he targeted any weakness he could in his target's defenses. But then he'd seen the notebook. The kid was probably a genius, and Nedzu would be salivating if he'd had a chance to read what Shoyuta had, and yet the kid insisted he wasn't smart. At first, Shoyuta had assumed he was joking, but the more he thought about the conversation they'd had earlier, the more he realized that Viridian honestly believed what he'd said. Shoyuta didn't know if he even wanted to think about what must have happened in Viridian's life to convince the kid that he was an idiot despite his obvious skills, and that was even more true if he had an analysis quirk. Which brought Shoyuta back to his list of concerns. If the kid thought he was stupid despite his intelligence, what other lies did he believe? Did he somehow think he was worthless? Did he think that his life was worth less than the lives of the people he saved? Shoyuta thought back to the fight with the crab villain. Viridian hadn't thought twice about giving up his weapons so Shoyuta could fight more effectively, and then the first thing he'd done after the fight was ask if Shoyuta was okay, with no regard for his own safety or well-being. It was like Viridian had decided in that moment that it was okay if he died, as long as Shoyuta lived. He stared at the marble again, seeing how the green and black swirled together. Was the kid? Oh, you got one too. Shoyuta flinched as Amplifier's overly peppy voice practically yelled behind him, and he almost dropped the marble. As it was, he fumbled it and only just managed to palm it before it rolled onto the floor. He turned to glare at Amplifier, who smiled sheepishly at him. Sorry? What do you guys have? Tsukachi asked as he walked up with paperwork and coffee. Viridian's got a new calling card. Amplifier grinned and dug around in her pockets before triumphantly showing Tsukachi a green marble identical to the one Shoyuta had almost dropped. He started throwing these instead of rocks so that we know it's him. Tsukachi frowned at the marble, then turned to Shoyuta. And you have one too? Shoyuta sighed and showed Tsukachi his marble. Honestly, he wouldn't be surprised if the marbles became a badge of honor among the local heroes. He could see them turning into a sort of membership card for an exclusive club of heroes Viridian trusted, even though Viridian went to heroes based on availability, not trust or competence. Still, he wouldn't put it beyond his colleagues to start collecting them. It seems he's embracing his popularity then. Tsukachi said bitterly. If he's putting in the extra effort to have a signature. I don't think that's what he had in mind. Shoyuta said as he put his marble away. I don't know if you've heard, but Viridian somehow got his hands on a slingshot, and the marbles are his primary ammo. As far as I know, he wasn't actually planning on them being a calling card. He has a slingshot? Amplifier bounced up and down in her seat. Have you seen him use it? Is his aim any good? Shoyuta nodded. He hasn't mastered it by any means, but he's good enough to get the job done. He led me to a group earlier and kept pelting them with marbles to distract them and make them easier for me to take down, and he didn't hit me once. He'll probably get better with it the longer he trains, but for now, he seems to be more comfortable with close-range combat. He has some dual-wielding pipes that he uses as bludgeoning weapons. Pipes? Tsukachi asked. Aren't they considered an improvised weapon? Why didn't he invest in something better, like Tonfa? There are more than enough illegal weapons dealers that he wouldn't have a problem finding something. And yet the problem child chooses to use something that can be bought at literally any hardware store. Shoyuta said. It does make him harder to track. Not that we're going to bother. Amplifier piped up. He's not hurting anyone. He's a vigilante. Tsukachi said sternly. And we need to be prepared to capture him if he ever crosses the line into villainy. You both know how common that is. They were all silent for a moment as they remembered Stendhal and the other vigilantes who had turned. Vigilantes tended to make extremely frightening villains. Viridian's still young. Shoyuta said finally. There's still time to guide him onto the right path. Yeah. Amplifier agreed. He's just a kid, so go easy on him, Tsuki. Tsukachi signed heavily. Just keep an eye on him. If he gives any indication that he's going too far, you need to bring him in. If we catch him quickly enough, he might even be a candidate for the Vigilante Rehabilitation Program. That dusty old thing? Amplifier asked. I thought it was just an artifact from the time when hero licenses were still getting started. Has anyone even gone through the program in the last few decades? It's not common by any means, Shoyuta said, because society expects heroes to start legally now, but the laws are still on the books. Since the program hasn't been overturned, law enforcement can still petition the Hero Commission to allow a vigilante to participate, provided that they don't use excessive force in their takedowns. And since vigilantes like Knuckleduster, who routinely beat villains to a pulp, are more common, Tsukachi said, most modern vigilantes don't qualify. The Hero Commission isn't likely to approve an untrained kid like Viridian for the program anyway, otherwise I'd try to get him approved now. I guess that makes sense. Amplifier pouted. But I would still love to see Viridian as a legit hero. Can you imagine seeing kids with green hoodies and little marbles on keychains or something? What makes you think he'll even want merch? Shoyuta said. He might want to stay underground. Don't be ridiculous. Amplifier waved away his concerns. He's a happy young teenager, of course he wants to be famous. Shoyuta frowned. The kid had only had one article written about him, but even that had seemed to make him uncomfortable. And Shoyuta was also worried that happy wasn't the right word to describe Viridian's mental. What's wrong, Eraser? Tsukachi asked. Something's nagging at you. It's just, Shoyuta dragged a hand down his face, making him look even more exhausted than he actually was. There's a lot of little things that have been adding up and I'm not quite sure what to do about it. Maybe we can help. Tsukachi said kindly. What's bothering you? I think Viridian might be depressed. Shoyuta said. What? Amplifier said. He's a teenage boy, why would he be depressed? From what I've gathered, he doesn't have the best life. Shoyuta started rolling the marble between his fingers again. Last night, he almost died helping me with a fight, but he was out again tonight, fighting like it had never even happened. So he's reckless. Tsukachi said. That's pretty common in teenagers. It doesn't mean he's depressed. Yes, being reckless is normal in teenagers. I'm a teacher, so I know that better than most, but Viridian's recklessness goes beyond what I see in my students. Shoyuta said. It's almost like he believes that his life isn't worth anything, which isn't an attitude someone develops overnight. You think he might be being abused? Tsukachi said in realization. Shoyuta shook his head. Not at home. Viridian's never mentioned that, but when I mentioned school once, the kid completely shut down. Bullies? Tsukachi said. Shoyuta nodded. He acts like he's used to hiding injuries and pain, so it's possible he's been trying to hide the bullying from his family. That means he's been treating his injuries himself, doesn't it? Amplifier said. Remember that first time I actually talked to him? A store clerk got severe burns during a robbery, and when I went to go check on the victim, Viridian had already given first aid. When I asked him how he knew how to do that, he just said he'd had a lot of practice. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but do you think? Shoyuta sighed. Unfortunately, yes, he most likely had to practice on himself. I don't think the bullying is entirely physical, though. Psychologically, he trailed off. It was just a hunch, but he hoped he was wrong. He hoped that Viridian was emotionally resilient and had access to the correct resources to deal with the abuse he faced at home. He hoped that the problem child had become a vigilante because he thought they were cool or to annoy the heroes. Tsukachi gestured for him to continue and Shoyuta sighed. He doesn't know his own worth. I got a peek at his notebook tonight and the kid is brilliant, but he seems to genuinely believe that he's stupid. He runs into fights that he isn't prepared for and he doesn't seem to care about his own safety, despite the fact that he is almost excessively worried about the safety of the victims and even the heroes he's fighting with. The first time I met him, I told him that he shouldn't get into fights because he didn't want to die and he hesitated. Shoyuta rubbed the bridge of his nose in exhaustion and frustration as Amplifier and Tsukachi stared at him with wide eyes. I think Viridian might be suicidal. A kick to Izuku's shin woke him up. Had he fallen asleep in class again? He'd been getting a lot less sleep since he started going out as a vigilante, which of course led to him getting more tired during the day, but it only got worse now that he had a still-healing concussion. His teachers didn't seem to care enough about Izuku to notice when he fell asleep in class, but his peers were apparently a different story. He looked up to see a few students crowded around his desk, but most of the class, including Kaken, had already left for lunch. "What's the matter, Deku?" That was the kid with extendable eyeballs that hung around Kaken sometimes. "Busy night whoring yourself out or something?" "No," a kid with a minor glow quirk said. "Deku's too useless even for that." Eyeballs laughed. "You're right. Just do everyone a favor, Deku, and die. Leave some oxygen for the people who actually deserve to breathe." Izuku stared at the floor and tried to ignore them as he gathered his books and stood to go to lunch. He was already halfway through the day. He could get through this. It was only another few hours. He made it all the way to the hall before his classmates started harassing him again. "Hey, Deku!" Eyeballs growled. "Are you ignoring us?" Izuku ran down the hall as fast as he could. If he could get to the lunchroom, then hopefully his classmates would get distracted by the promise of food, and even if they weren't, the beatings tended to be a little better if there were a lot of people around. Unfortunately, in his haste to get away, Izuku forgot to watch where he was going and ran straight into the kid in his class whose hair was made of boulders. "Watch it, Deku," Boulders said. "I'm sorry." Izuku stuttered. I wasn't looking where I was going, and I just want to go to lunch, so." He tried to duck around him, but Boulders put a large hand on his shoulder and shoved him back before he could. "Do you think you can just run into me and not face any consequences?" Izuku started shaking and turned around. If he could run before the other two caught up, then he might be able to take a different route to the lunchroom, and "There you are, Deku." Eyeballs leered at him as he and Glow cut off his patch of escape. Izuku glanced behind him, only to see Boulders standing threateningly behind him. "Were you guys looking for this nerd?" Boulders asked. "Deku here thinks he can ignore us." Glow said, "Yeah." Eyeballs leaned into Izuku's personal space. "He thinks he's better than us." Izuku shrank. "No, that's not it at all. I just really think we should be getting to lunch." "No." Boulders turned both fists into rocks and slammed Izuku up against the wall. "I think maybe we should teach this quirkless loser a lesson first." Inko rushed to the school in a panic, almost forgetting her purse at work in her hurry to get to Izuku. The woman on the phone hadn't said much, just that Izuku had gotten into a fight at school and that she needed to come pick him up. A fight? Her baby didn't get into fights. He watched them, he analyzed them, but he didn't get into them. What had happened? What if Izuku was hurt? What if Inko shook her head? No, she couldn't let her anxiety get the best of her right now. Izuku needed her. She needed to be calm for Izuku. When she finally reached the school, she hurried through the front doors and followed the signs to the front office. "Excuse me. I got a call from you about my son, Izuku?" "Mrs. Midoriya?" the secretary asked. Inko recognized her voice as the one who had called her, telling her to come in. Inko nodded and the secretary gestured to a door off to one side of the office. "The principal is already waiting for you. Go right in." "Thank you." Inko rushed through the door but stopped and put her hand over her mouth when she caught sight of Izuku. "Oh, baby." Izuku was huddling in a chair across from the angry-looking principal. His uniform was torn and would definitely need to be replaced, but that wasn't what brought tears to Inko's eyes. No, what brought tears to her eyes was the mottled collection of new bruises covering her son's face and neck. From the way the bruises dipped below his collar, Inko had no doubt that his arms and torso were in a similar state. What had happened? "Mrs. Midoriya, you're here. Good." The principal gestured for her to take the chair beside Izuku. "Now that you've finally arrived, we can discuss Izuku's punishment." "Punishment?" Inko looked between the principal and Izuku, who seemed to be trying to make himself small enough to disappear with no luck. "You haven't even told me what this is about?" As my secretary explained over the phone, Izuku instigated a fight. A fight? Inko looked at the principal incredulously. "Look at the state of my son. That wasn't a fight, it was a beating." The principal's mouth tightened into a stern frown. He attacked a number of his classmates unprovoked and forced them to take defensive action. As I'm sure you are aware, Mrs. Midoriya, our school has a zero-tolerance policy toward fighting, and as such, I am suspending Izuku for 2 weeks. Suspension? Inko shook her head. What about the other students? Are they being suspended too for what they did to my son? The principal glared at Izuku, then at her. We are not in the habit of punishing victims for defending themselves, Mrs. Midoriya. Your son was the one who started the fight, so he's the one who will receive punishment. What? Inko couldn't help raising her voice. But my son didn't start that fight. I know Izuku, he wouldn't do that. Those other children. If you have a problem with the way I run my school, Mrs. Midoriya, the principal interrupted, then perhaps you should find a different one. Inko stared at him in disbelief. What? That will be all, Mrs. Midoriya. The principal turned back to the papers on his desk. Izuku will not be allowed back in school for the next 2 weeks. If he shows up on campus, you will have to come pick him up, and if it happens again, we will have no choice but to pursue legal action. Have a nice day. For the first time, Inko realized that the principal hadn't once tried to ask her son for his side of the story or even allowed him to defend himself since she'd arrived. There was always the possibility that he'd given Izuku that chance before she'd gotten to the school, but with the way the conversation had gone, Inko didn't think that was very likely. She'd been called here so the principal could execute punishment, not to resolve the situation or figure out what really happened. Izuku didn't look up as they left and started walking toward the train station. What had been happening at that school? What had Izuku been going through? She knew that there had been a few problems with some kids being mean to him right after he was diagnosed quirkless, but he'd always told her so they could report the issue and then he'd said they stopped. Unless it never actually stopped. Did it? Inko watched as Izuku froze, then seemed to physically force himself to keep watching. Her poor baby, he'd been going through all this alone for years. Why didn't he tell her? They were all each other had. He should have told her. She could have what? Gone to the principal? A fat lot of good that would have done. What could she have even done, if she had known? I'm not mad at you, Izuku, she said quietly. I'm sad that you felt like you couldn't tell me, but I understand why you didn't. You can be honest with me, baby. The bullying didn't stop, did it? Izuku swallowed, then shook his head, and Inko felt her heart break. Her baby was never this quiet. What had those boys been doing to him to force Izuku, who could hardly think without mumbling, to go completely silent? She wanted to. Well, it probably wasn't very healthy to want to hurt children. But they had hurt Izuku. They deserved it. Thank you for telling me, baby. Inko said. I'm here. I don't know what we're gonna do, because the school obviously isn't going to be any help, but we'll get through this together, okay? Izuku looked up at her and smiled shakily, then winced as they started going down the stairs to the station. Inko frowned and looked at her son a little more closely. Sure, that wince could have been from any one of his numerous bruises, but had he been cradling his left arm like that the whole time? How had she not noticed that? Well, she'd probably been distracted by the bruises and the JRK that called himself the principal, so she couldn't blame herself, but from the way he was holding it, his arm had to be in a lot of pain. Izuku, what's the matter with your arm? Izuku froze and looked up at her with scared wide eyes before forcing a smile onto his face. It's nothing, Mom. Don't worry about it. Inko frowned. The first words her son had spoken to her since this whole mess began, and he was trying to convince her that everything was fine. He obviously wasn't fine. It's not nothing, Izuku, you look like you're in pain. Let me see it. Izuku shook his head and tried to rush ahead further into the station. Inko didn't know what possessed her to grab his injured arm to hold him back. Ow! Izuku screamed and snatched his arm away from her, the tears he'd been holding back falling freely down his cheeks. Inko held up her hands calmingly. Izuku, baby, you're hurt, just let me look at it. He hesitated a long moment before extending the arm out to her and looking away in embarrassment. She gently rolled up the sleeve and gasped. The whole arm was turning an ugly shade of purple, and Inko really hoped she was imagining the strange way it seemed to bend now that Izuku wasn't holding it against his body. Izuku, we're going to the hospital. Izuku snatched his arm back again and rolled down the sleeve. Mom, I don't need. She shot him a look that shut him up. Izuku, from the looks of it, that arm might be broken. You need to go to the hospital. Izuku went silent again as they switched directions and got on the train that would take them to the hospital, rather than taking them home. Inko didn't like her son going silent like this, but it was preferable to him lying and insisting he was fine when he obviously wasn't. What were they going to do? Izuku let Mom lead him into the waiting room, and he sat down while she went to the desk to fill out the paperwork. When she was done, she came and sat beside him, but there wasn't anything she could say to make the situation better, so they just sat silently until Izuku's name was called. A nurse led them into an examination room and took Izuku's vitals. She took in Izuku's bruises, then looked at Inko suspiciously. What happened? Nothing. Izuku said quickly. I just fell. There was a fight at school. Inko interrupted. He's been hiding the bullying from me, so it makes sense he'd hide it from you as well, but you don't have to do that anymore, Izuku. Izuku stared at the ground again, and the nurse nodded before she left to go get the doctor. Izuku. Whatever she was going to say was cut off by the doctor opening the door. Izuku Midoriya? Izuku nodded and the doctor sat down beside the examination table he was sitting on. Can you tell me what's going on? I'm fine. Izuku said, I can handle it, Mom's just worried. Izuku. Inko was starting to get exasperated. Why wouldn't Izuku let them help him? That's okay. The doctor smiled. I'm sure you're a strong young man. But why don't you show me what your mom's worried about, to ease her nerves at the very least? Izuku frowned for a moment before shrugging off his uniform jacket, then his shirt, struggling as he tried to undo the buttons one-handed. Inko almost helped him, but one look was enough to tell her that Izuku needed to do that much on his own. She struggled not to gasp in horror when she saw the collection of bruises that had been hiding beneath his clothes, some already in the healing stages, which meant that this was far from the only beating Izuku had received. The doctor, though, just took the injuries in stride and gently started prodding at his arm. Does this hurt? Izuku winced, but shook his head. The doctor sighed. I'd feel more comfortable getting some x-rays, okay? Mrs. Midoriya, you stay here, and I'll walk Izuku over to radiology, okay? Izuku thought everyone was overreacting. Sure, his arm hurt, but it wasn't broken. Probably. Honestly, Izuku hadn't thought through what would happen if it was and they hadn't gone to the hospital, but his arm didn't hurt enough to be broken. After the x-rays were taken, he was expecting the doctor to lead him back to the room where his mom was waiting, but the doctor led him to a different one instead. The doctor closed the door and turned to face Izuku. Midoriya? I just want to let you know that you're safe here and we will do everything in our power to help you, okay? Izuku nodded. He wasn't quite sure why the doctor was telling him this. Wasn't that what doctors were there for? Good. The doctor sighed. Now, is everything okay at home? Izuku looked at the doctor in confusion. Yes? Why wouldn't it be? Well, sometimes when kids come in with injuries like yours. Izuku's eyes widened. You think Mom did this to me? No, he tried to instinctively wave his arms in front of him, but winced at the pain the action caused. No, Mom would never hurt me. Are you sure? The doctor asked softly. You don't have to protect her. No. Izuku started crying again. I love my mom. I didn't tell her about the bullying because I didn't want her to worry and there's nothing she could have done anyways and I didn't want to get anyone in trouble, but then it got worse and I still didn't tell her and then today happened and then the principal called and I didn't want to come here and now she's gonna get in trouble and it's all my fault and… Breath, Midoriya. The doctor sounded slightly panicked. Your mom isn't going to get in trouble. We just needed to make sure that there wasn't any abuse happening and for that, we needed to ask without her in the room. I didn't mean to scare you, I'm sorry. Izuku nodded shakily. Okay, that makes sense. Sorry. The doctor smiled. It's not your fault. I'm glad your mom's taking care of you, just don't let her know in the future. Make her job a little easier, okay? Okay. He felt a little bad for lying to the doctor, but things would be so much better if Mom just thought this was an isolated incident. She wouldn't have to worry so much. The doctor walked him back to the room where Mom was waiting and opened the file the radiologist gave him. All right, it looks like you have a break in your left arm, but your ribs are fine, so that's the good news. I just need to set the bone and put a cast on it and you'll be good to go. What color do you want? Izuku shrugged. A few months ago, he probably would have gone with all might colors, but now, green's fine. He decided finally. It didn't need to match his vigilante gear, but green was his vigilante color, so it made him feel that useful? Not like a Deku who got his arm broken at school and got his mother accused of child abuse. He was so stupid. The cast took longer to put on than Izuku had thought it would. It had to dry in between the various layers, but by the end, he had a semi-comfortable cast that encased his arm from the elbow down. Now if only he actually had friends to sign it. Alright, Midoriyas, you're almost good to go. I'll just send in the nurse who can go over how to care for the cast. Thank you so much. Mom said. The doctor smiled. My pleasure. Once they were alone, the same awkward silence fell that had dominated the whole afternoon. Inko looked over at Izuku and wondered how to bring up what she'd started thinking about while Izuku had been getting his x-rays. I don't think that school is working, she said finally. Izuku looked at her. What? The school, she said. I don't think it's a good fit. If they knew what those other kids were doing to you and blamed you instead of doing anything to stop it, then, she sighed. But I know how close you've always been with Katsuki. I don't want to separate you from him. Izuku bit his lip and Inko could see his brain working overtime as he debated what to say. I don't think Kaken would miss me. Inko felt her heart break all over again. Had Katsuki? She'd hoped that he had protected Izuku because he wanted to be a hero, but with how broken Izuku sounded, and how convinced he seemed that Katsuki wouldn't miss him, then oh, her poor baby. We could look into transferring you to a different school, she said. To her surprise, Izuku shook his head. There wouldn't be any point. I'm the problem and that's going to be the same wherever I go. Going to a new school would just mean I'd be quirkless and the new kid. Inko frowned. Unfortunately, she saw Izuku's logic. The bullying had started because he was diagnosed quirkless and Izuku was right. That wasn't going to change. She'd like to believe that a new school would be better and kinder, but kids were cruel. There was a good chance his new classmates would be just as bad or even worse than the ones he had now. She couldn't do that to him. But she also couldn't, in good conscience, send him back to Aldra. Not after how they'd had the audacity to blame him for being bullied. But what other options were there? What if we could find something online? She suggested. You can't be bullied by other students if there are none. Izuku looked skeptical. Does something like that even exist? Inko shrugged. I don't know, but if it does, would you at least look into it? See if it's something you'd be interested in? Izuku thought for a long moment and Inko was starting to get worried she'd somehow said the wrong thing when Izuku smiled. I promise I'll look into it when we get home. Tomorrow. Inko said. When we get home, we're not going to worry about anything except eating dinner and watching TV. Deal? Izuku laughed. Deal? There was a knock on the door and the nurse walked in. Hello, Midoriyas. I'm here to give you some instructions, then you'll be good to go. That cast needs to stay on for about 6 weeks to give your arm adequate time to heal. Keep it dry and don't participate in any sports or vigorous activities that could irritate your arm until you get the cast off. Make sure to call us if you think anything is wrong and that's about it. You're free to go. Mom thanked the nurse and they left. Izuku felt his stomach twist as he mentally reviewed the instructions. He wasn't allowed to do any physical activity that could jostle his arm for the next month and a half. If he did, he could re-injure his arm, which would just cause more trouble for everyone and put Mom through all this worry all over again, and he couldn't do that to her. So what was he supposed to do about his vigilantism? Shoyuta looked over the file for the crab villain as he waited for Tsukachi to arrive so they could interrogate him. Of all the trigger dealers he'd shaken down over the past few years, most just evaded his questions and a few tried to run, but no one else had shot up before he had the chance to ask a single question. In Shuta's line of work, a reaction like that meant that the person had something to hide. According to his files, the crab villain was named Jun Hamasaki and some mid-level dealers had pointed Shoyuta his way, saying that he sold them the drags. He couldn't be anywhere near the top, he didn't have anywhere near enough connections to bring the drags over from America, but he was the highest-level dealer Shoyuta had found so far. Everything pointed to Hamasaki knowing something. which is why he had fought tooth and nail, even against a kid like Viridian. Shoyuta took a deep breath and reminded himself that trigger often induced rage, so Hamasaki probably hadn't been thinking entirely clearly when he almost killed Viridian. Shoyuta tried to ignore the voice in his head that said that he'd been thinking clearly when he dosed himself, and he clearly knew what would happen. It wouldn't do any good to punch Hamasaki in the face the moment he entered the interrogation room, but that didn't mean Shoyuta had to like the guy. Tsukaki calmly walked through the door to the station and put his trench coat on the chair at his desk. "Sorry I'm late, Eraser. I was having lunch with an old friend." Shoyuta grunted in response. "Are you ready?" Squatchy nodded and took the file, then led Shoyuta to the room where Hamasaki was waiting. They had to pass through the observation room first, which meant that Shoyuta got a good look at the villain through the glass. He had been expecting the guy to be defiant, considering how hard he'd fought to avoid being arrested, but instead Hamasaki was pale and jittery. He looked terrified. Tsukachi saw him staring. "He's been like that ever since you brought him in. We've tried telling him he's safe here, but he obviously doesn't believe us. It definitely lends credence to your assumption that he actually knows something." Shoyuta nodded and followed Tsukachi through the door. They both sat down at the table opposite Hamasaki, who looked even worse close up. One of his hands was tapping at the table and a thin sheen of sweat coated his forehead despite the fact that the room was air-conditioned. He had information, that much was certain. The only problem now was getting him to talk. "All right, you know why you're here," Tsukachi began. "Eraserhead picked you up a few days ago for trigger possession and assaulting a pro-hero, both of which have prison sentences attached. However, the law is willing to be lenient and take time off your sentence if you provide us with useful information." Hamasaki shook his head. "I don't know nothing. You fought tooth and nail to avoid answering my questions." Shoyuta said dryly. "Who sells you the trigger? I don't know what you're talking about." Hamasaki glanced up at the camera and Shoyuta frowned. Was he scared of dirty cops? That couldn't be. Sure, the trigger operation was growing, but villains had to have a significant amount of power to pull a cop to their side, and that took time. Trigger had only been in Japan a few years, so he had to be scared of someone else. "We could try to find a way to sweeten the deal." Tsukachi tried. "Surely there's something that would make your life more comfortable behind bars. Maybe protective custody? Doesn't matter how comfortable a cell is if you never live to see it." Hamasaki muttered. "We have the resources to protect you," Shoyuta said. "Whoever's behind Trigger, they can't be powerful enough to reach you in witness protection." "You're underestimating him," Hamasaki said darkly. "You think it's just some guys in their mom's basement, but that couldn't be farther from the truth. You don't know what you're dealing with." Shoyuta looked at Tsukachi, who leaned forward. "Then tell us. Who are you so afraid of?" Hamasaki hesitated, then slammed his mouth shut. "No. I'm not saying nothing else." "Well then I guess we'll just have to learn the hard way." Tsukachi stood up. "Come on, Eraser. This guy obviously doesn't want to tell us anything. It's his fault if we die because we didn't know who to avoid." Shoyuta stood. He wasn't sure Hamasaki was going to be so easily manipulated, but Tsukachi had already made his move and, well, it was worth a try. They certainly weren't going to get anything by bargaining. To his surprise, they had hardly opened the door to leave when Hamasaki spoke up. "No one's ever seen him." Shoyuta and Tsukachi shared a glance, then closed the door and sat back down. "It's just one man?" Tsukachi asked. "Behind the whole trigger operation?" "It's bigger than you think," Hamasaki said softly. "It's not just Trigger, but just stop looking into it. He's too powerful, you'll never stand a chance." So the man behind the Japanese trigger operation had a fearsome reputation. It wasn't the first time Shoyuta had run into a villain who used his reputation to make sure people didn't fight back. Most of the time, those guys were all bark and no bite. They talked up their quirks and connections, but were B-ranked villains at the worst, not the S-ranked ones they made themselves out to be. "Do you have a name?" Tsukachi asked. "So we know who to avoid." Hamasaki shook his head. "Nobody knows his name, but they call him the symbol of evil." Shoyuta narrowed his eyes. "The symbol of evil? Like a play on the symbol of peace?" No wonder people were so scared of this guy if he made himself out to be All Might's equal. He glanced over at Tsukachi, surprised to see fear in his expression as well. He had to know that this symbol of evil was bluffing, right? Suddenly, a piercing alarm split the air, making all three of them flinch. Sansa came running into the room not a second later, fur on end as he yelled, "There's a villain attack right outside. We need all hands on deck." Shoyuta swore and ran outside, hands already on his capture weapon. There was a small crowd outside and civilians were screaming as they ran away from the dozen or so minor villains that were attacking at random, like they were trying to do the greatest damage in the least amount of time. The media vultures were already starting to pull up and film, though they at least had the good sense to stay away from the main fight. The villains were more like thugs, but there were still enough of them to be dangerous if Shoyuta didn't take them down quickly. He activated his quirk and looked at the closest one, some guy with bullets shooting out of his fingers, then quickly wrapped him up and flung him toward the waiting police, then started in on the next one. Rocklock had turned up while Shoyuta had been fighting, so he managed to take one of the villains down by locking a rope in place around him. Between the two of them, it only took them another 10 minutes to round up all the villains and get them into police custody. It wouldn't have taken so long if there weren't so many of them. Gangs hadn't been a problem since All Might Beam #1, so how had so many thugs decided to attack the police station at the same time? They had to be pretty stupid to attack a place that they knew was filled with police. Even if they weren't scared of the cops, pro-heroes were always in and out of the station, so why attack? It just didn't make sense. Slowly, they managed to get all the villains off the street and into the holding cells inside the station. There was going to be so much paperwork. Thankfully, most of it would be done by the police themselves, but still, Shoyuta wasn't looking forward to it. That could wait, however, until he and Tsukachi finished interrogating Hamasaki. The attack had terrible timing. They had just been starting to get useful information when they'd both had to leave to handle the attack, so hopefully they'd be able to just pick up where they left off, though Shoyuta wasn't getting his hopes up. It had been a miracle they'd been able to get as much as they had out of the guy, and the attack would probably have spooked him silent. It was annoying. He tracked down Tsukachi and together they made their way to the interrogation room. Shoyuta almost didn't bother looking through the window before entering, but when he did he had to do a double take. He looked at Tsukachi to make sure he wasn't seeing things before they both swore and barged into the empty room. "This is the same interrogation room, right?" he asked. "This is where we left him?" "Yes." Tsukachi looked pale. "He was still cuffed to the table when we left." Shoyuta looked more closely at the room. The cuffs were gone as well, which wasn't normal for an escape. Most of the villains who tried would pick the cuffs, then leave them behind so they wouldn't be slowed down by the dead weight. If Shoyuta didn't know better, he'd almost say that Hamasaki had never been there at all. Tsukachi was already striding back out into the bullpen. "Sansa, what happened to the villain we had in interrogation room 6? Shoyuta followed to see Sansa at the front desk looking through the logbook. "It says here he was transferred, but that can't be right. The villains were blocking the front entrance, so I suppose they could have taken him out the back, but the attack was taking up almost all of our manpower. The person who transferred him also forgot to sign their name." "Pull up the security feed," Shoyuta said. "The cameras must have caught them leaving." Sansa grimaced. "One of the villains' attacks missed their target and hit the power box. We just barely got the lights back on 5 minutes ago, but the station was in a blackout for most of the attack. So the cameras weren't recording." Tsukachi clarified. "No, sir." Shoyuta looked at Tsukachi and could tell he was thinking the exact same thing. The attack wasn't random, neither was the power outage. The entire thing had been engineered by someone who didn't want Hamasaki to talk to them. Shoyuta had been wrong. Whoever was behind the trigger operation was more powerful than he'd thought possible. And the only lead he had was the symbol of evil. Izuka had spent the entire day so far researching online schools while Mom was at work. She tried to stay home, but she'd had to leave early yesterday because Izuku was too useless to stay out of trouble, so Izuku wasn't about to make her miss work again, just so he wouldn't be alone. Thankfully, she'd listened when he pointed out that he wouldn't be doing anything besides sitting on the couch all day, which he didn't need 2 arms for anyway, and she'd left after she made him promise to keep the door locked. he was just happy that he wasn't holding her. But in any case, if he was able to transfer to online school, he'd have to get used to being home alone during the day, since mom obviously couldn't afford to quit her job. There weren't that many online schools, and those that did exist were mostly some sort of mixed format where students still had to show up once a week. That would probably be better than going back to Aldra, since he would only have to deal with bullies occasionally, rather than every day, but something told him mom wouldn't see it that way. The whole point of him going to an online school was so that he wouldn't have to deal with having classmates, so if he still had to attend classes, even infrequently, mom would worry about how he was being treated. Izuku hated it when mom had to worry about him. She didn't deserve having a garbage son like him, she deserved a son she could be proud of, a son with a quirk. But that wasn't going to happen, so it was Izuku's responsibility to make sure she worried as little as possible. That meant that he couldn't just put up with weekly bullying, since mom might not believe him if he lied and said his classmates were being nice. That left him to find a school that was entirely online. There were only 2 schools that did not require in-person attendance. One of them seemed almost like a traditional school, where students showed up in video chat classrooms at set times and turned in homework every day just like Izuku was used to at Aldra. There were 2 problems with that school, however. The first was that it seemed to include group projects, which might lead to Izuku being left out at best and cyberbullied at worst. The second was that it only accepted new students at the beginning of the semester, which meant that Izuku would have to stay at Aldra for several months until he was able to transfer. He couldn't do that to mom. That left Izuku with his final and only option. It apparently had options for everything from grade school until the end of high school and was entirely remote. According to their website, Izuku would just read articles and watch lectures associated with each lesson, then take tests and do assignments to test his learning. He would be able to work at his own pace, so he wouldn't have to worry about how stupid he was, he could just go slower than average. He did have to complete each semester class within 6 months, but that sounded like something he could handle. And mom wouldn't have to worry about him having classmates that would bully him. There was only one problem. He would have to pass an entrance exam. He could take it at any time, so he wouldn't have to worry about going back to Aldra while he waited for the new semester to start. But was Izuku really smart enough to pass? Kaken didn't even get straight A's and he was so much smarter than Izuku. What if he took the test and didn't pass? Would he have to go back to Aldra? Mom would be so disappointed. He really was the worst son, wasn't he? He ignored the voice in his head that said that Eraserhead thought he was smart. Eraser had just been being polite when he saw Izuku's notebook. There was no way he actually thought Izuku was intelligent. But Eraser wasn't worried about being polite, so he could be telling the truth. Izuku shook his head. That was too confusing. It was just easier to firmly remind himself that he was an idiot, just like Kaken and his teachers always said, and leave it at that. That way he wouldn't get his hopes up. When he inevitably failed out at the entrance exam, it would still hurt and mom would still be worried, but at least he would already be expecting it. It was for the best. Katsuki felt sick. The entire school was talking about how Deku got suspended. Boulders had been bragging about it all day, as had the other 2 extras that had been involved, so everyone already knew how Deku had been beat up so badly that the principal had to call Auntie Inko to come pick him up. Glow had said it was his idea to pin the whole thing on Deku, like he was proud of his creative thinking, and the principal had fallen for it hook, line, and sinker. But Deku couldn't have started that fight. Katsuki knew that, Auntie Inko knew that, and the principal sure as hell knew that. So why had the school gone along with Glow's story? Deku was a quirkless weakling who couldn't even defend himself, so why would he start a fight with his classmates? Sure, those extras didn't have awesome quirks like Katsuki's, but their weak butt quirks were better than nothing, and Deku had those stalker notebooks, and he obviously knew he couldn't win, and even he wasn't stupid enough to pick a fight, so what did the school get from blaming Deku? Well, those 3 extras who had beaten him up had gotten off scot-free. But it shouldn't matter to the school who got the punishment, right? They should be punishing those who were actually at fault, so that they knew they did something wrong. That's what heroes did, at least. They put the bad guys in prison so they wouldn't do anything bad in the future, even after they got out. Wasn't that the way things worked? If the principal was letting these guys get away with what they did, then who else had he let get away with stuff? Were there villains out there who were out beating people up because the school hadn't done anything to stop them back when they went here? That was kinda messed up. It was a good thing that Katsuki knew better than to. Katsuki froze. How much had he gotten away with? He had already had to come to terms with the fact that he hadn't been acting like a hero, but he hadn't been acting like a villain, right? The teachers all knew he wanted to be a hero. They all told him he'd be a good one. They wouldn't just do nothing if he'd been acting like a villain, not when they all knew he was going to be the next number one. But he'd hurt Deku, and it was villains who hurt people. Not heroes. Not civilians. Villains. Villains hurt people. He hurt people. He was a villain. Katsuki couldn't keep himself from exploding his pencil, but the only reprimand he got was a stern look from the teacher for interrupting class. Katsuki couldn't help but wonder what would have happened to Deku if he'd done something like that, obviously not exploding his pencil, because he didn't have a quirk to do that, but if he'd been loud, he'd probably have gotten detention at the very least. Why had no one ever given him detention? The school hadn't even done anything when he'd told Deku. Katsuki crushed the charred remainders of the pencil. The teachers heard those extras telling Deku to kill himself every DMN day, but they still didn't do anything. How long had Katsuki been a villain without realizing it? He couldn't trust his teachers, not anymore. How was he supposed to be the best if they wouldn't even tell him what he was doing wrong? He had to be better. He had to change and actually act like a hero if he was ever going to be the best. And he was going to be the best. He was going to be the best hero, no matter what stupid challenges got in his way, no matter how much he had to change, no matter if those stupid teachers couldn't be bothered to do their FING jobs, Katsuki was going to be the best. But how? Jun Hamasaki woke up chained to a table. Immediately, he started pulling at the chains and even tried cutting them with his claws, but without any trigger in his system, there was no way he'd be getting out. What happened? He'd been at the police station, then there had been alarms and that detective had left alongside the hero who arrested him, then another officer had come in and opened a tiny bottle with a single mechanical. He groaned. He knew the symbol of evil, whoever he was powerful enough to have some dirty cops on his side. He should have known that they wouldn't leave him in police custody. He knew too much. It probably didn't even matter that he'd said anything, they still would have dragged him back here anyway. Speaking of, where exactly was here? It would have been easier to just kill him, inject him with a poison rather than a sedative, but instead they'd kept him alive. Well, as long as this wasn't the place they did their experiments, he'd be fine. The door creaked open and Jun craned his neck to try and get a better look at either the room or his visitor, but unfortunately, aside from a bright lamp over his head, the rest of the room was dark. There was some shuffling in the general direction of the door, then he heard a high-pitched squeaking that set his teeth on edge, almost like someone had forgotten to oil the wheels on one of those old metal wagons. The comparison wasn't too far off, apparently, because his visitor finally stepped into the light pushing an old metal cart loaded with a variety of tools and bottles that Jun didn't want to know the uses of. His blood ran cold as he realized the man was wearing large round glasses and a lab coat. The doctor. The doctor took a voice recorder from his pocket and pressed a button. Phase 3, Experiment 2. Hypothesis. Through a combination of mutation and trigger, an elevated quirk level can be achieved even after the drag is out of the system. Please, don't do this. Jun didn't care that pulling at the chains hadn't worked before. He couldn't be turned into it didn't matter if none of the others remembered the actual experimentation. He didn't want it. This couldn't be happening. The doctor didn't seem to care about his pleas, though, since he picked up a thick syringe off the cart and moved to stand over the table, the light reflecting off his thick round glasses so Jun couldn't see his eyes. Time of first injection, 8:24 p.m. Izuku had spent the last week cramming nonstop for his entrance exam. He still wasn't entirely confident in his ability to pass, but he'd reached the point in his studying where he was starting to forget more than he learned, which probably meant that he should just take the exam even if he'd inevitably fail. At least then he'd be able to move on and put his eggs in other baskets. Mom was at work and had left that morning after giving him a kiss on the cheek and wishing him luck on his test. She had promised him katsudon that evening as well, either as a congratulatory meal or as comfort food. It would depend on how Izuku thought he did. Izuku didn't really see the point of her going through all that trouble for him, but there was a selfish part of him that was just so happy that she cared. He wished that part didn't feel so good. It made the rest of him feel worse. Just before noon, Izuku finally put his books to the side and went to the school's website, clicking on the tab that would take him to the entrance exam. He spent about half an hour filling out his basic information, like his name, what other schools he'd gone to, his GPA for the last year, etc., cursing the fact that his cast made it so hard to type. He could still move his fingers, but his entire arm itched and started to ache if he used it too much, so at least for the next few days, he'd be stuck chicken pecking at the keyboard. It was annoying. Finally, he reached the welcome screen and read through the instructions. The test itself was 200 questions, and he had 3 hours to complete it. Izuku glanced at the clock. It was 12 o'clock, which meant that he had until 3 o'clock to finish the exam. That would mean he had just under a minute to answer each question, but that didn't count the time that he'd have to use to check over his answers at the end. Izuku took one last shaky breath before clicking the button that said, "Start exam." The questions were deceptively easy. Izuku had assumed that he'd have to rush to complete each question in under a minute, but he was able to answer most questions almost instantly, which gave him more time on the more difficult questions, like the ones in the math section. If Izuku wasn't freaking out about the fact that his entire future depended on him doing well on this test, he'd almost say it was fun? Was that weird? He could almost hear Kaken telling him that he was a DMN nerd. Before he knew it, Izuku had answered every single question. He sighed in relief and looked at the clock. It was now 1:25, which meant he still had to wait a minute. Izuku felt a cold wave of anxiety wash over him. How long did he have again? Izuku knew it had a 3 in it, but did that mean he had 3 hours? Or was it 1 hour, 30 minutes? How long was he supposed to spend? He couldn't have finished in under half the time, so it must have just been an hour and a half, which meant that he only had. Izuku looked over at the clock again and started freaking out. It was 1:28. He only had 2 minutes. He didn't have any time to look over his answers. But if he didn't look over his answers, he wouldn't have a chance to change any of his answers, which meant he had no chance of passing. Unless he really did have a full 3 hours. But if he didn't have a full 3 hours and tried to go back and check his answers, then he'd miss the deadline and fail by default. But if he didn't check his answers, then he wouldn't pass. How long did he have? Was it 3 hours or an hour and a half? Izuku glanced at the clock one last time. 1:29. It was better safe than sorry, right? Wasn't it better to get half the questions wrong than turn it in late? Izuku flailed as he scrambled to press submit, then frantically froze as he realized what he'd just done. What had he just done? This was terrible. He hadn't even checked any of his answers. His eyes stung as he tried to hold back his tears. It looked like Mom's katsudon was going to be a comfort meal, after all. Shoyuta curled up in the corner of the staff room at lunch and scrolled through the obituaries. He vaguely knew that he was just making things worse for himself, but he couldn't help checking every day, a sick sense of dread deep in his stomach as he desperately hoped that he wouldn't recognize any of the photos. Not that he'd ever seen Viridian without the mask, but he knew that the kid was young and had green hair. Plus, the fact that suicide would be listed as the cause of death would be a dead giveaway. When the kid hadn't shown his face for a few days, Shoyuta had hoped that he'd finally taken some time off to heal from some of his injuries. He'd thought that maybe the kid had actually grown a small sense of self-preservation, but that only went so far, and it had now been over a week since Shoyuta had seen Viridian. He'd even checked with Amplifier and Rocklock, but neither of them had seen him, and Tsukachi said that no one matching Viridian's description had been found dead from a villain fight. Even some of the other nocturnal heroes were starting to ask about the missing problem child, and they didn't even run into Viridian that often in the first place. Shoyuta really hoped that Viridian's sudden disappearance didn't mean anything, that maybe the kid's parents had somehow found out about his nightly activities and that they had forced him to stop, or maybe that he had just gotten bored, but deep down he knew that wasn't the case. The problem child had thrown himself headfirst into vigilantism to the point where he had become entrenched in the city's hero scene in only a few months, and the kid seemed to enjoy it, so Shoyuta couldn't imagine that he'd ever give that up, not unless. He shook his head and put away his phone. It wouldn't do any good to worry himself into exhaustion. The most he could do was keep an eye on the obituaries and hope to every deity he knew that Viridian hadn't decided that suicide by villain was taking too long. Maybe he was just reading too far into things and Viridian's mental health wasn't nearly as bad it seemed and he was just out of town. But if he was just out of town, then why hadn't he given any warning before disappearing? Yuta groaned and stretched as he emerged from his cocoon to get ready for his next class. Thankfully, his current class had responded well to his logical ruse, and he hadn't had to permanently expel that many of them, so he still had quite a few students who were actually showing promise now that they were taking things seriously. He just needed to remind himself that he had more than enough brats to worry about without fretting about the problem child. Didn't make things any easier, but it was the most logical course of action. "Hey, Yuta!" Mick's yell made him flinch and wish he'd actually gotten a nap. "You look like a mess. Is something on your mind?" "Doesn't he always look like a mess?" Snipe asked. "What's the difference?" Yuta glared at him while Midnight struggled to hold back laughter. "I can't explain it." Mike insisted. But Yuta has his normal dishevelment and his anxious dishevelment, and today, it looks like he's worried about something. "Is one of your students giving you trouble?" "Not one of my official ones." Yuta muttered, but it didn't seem like anyone heard him. "Oh, are you gonna expel someone else?" Ectoplasm asked. "Dang, I'm gonna lose the bet." Yuta glared at them. "You shouldn't bet about how likely I am to expel my students." "We're not betting on if you'll expel your students." Mike yelled. "No, we're betting on when you'll expel your students." Midnight added helpfully. Yuta groaned. "If you must know, I'm worried about something on my patrol. There's just a vigilante that's been hanging around and I haven't seen him for a while. I'm just hoping nothing's happened to him, that all." Midnight grinned. "I knew you had a heart. What are you gonna do?" "There's not much I can do." Yuta grumbled. "DMN problem child." "Well," Mike said, "when he shows his face again, ground him. That'll teach him to mess with you." Yuta rolled his eyes and ignored the sick sense of worry in his stomach that just wouldn't go away. He wished that he'd noticed Viridian's depression sooner. Maybe. If he'd caught it before the kid had disappeared, he could have convinced the kid to get some therapy. Even if Viridian refused to go, Yuta still could have found some way to help so that the kid didn't feel like he had to. Well, he just hoped it wasn't too late. But one thing was sure, if by some miracle, Viridian was still alive, Yuta wouldn't make the same mistake twice. After changing out of his school clothes, Katsuki walked to the address he'd found on the internet. The building was plain, just a community center with a shitty playground off to one side and a couple of rooms for art classes and support groups, but he ignored them for right now and walked to the front desk. The lady behind it smiled at him as she waited for him to find the words. "Stupid, why was this so hard?" I was wondering," Katsuki cringed. He was practically stuttering almost like Deku. "I was wondering if there was a hero named Amplifier here? I read on your website that." The receptionist nodded. "Sure thing. Amplifier." She called back into the offices behind her. "You got a visitor." "Awesome." Amplifier was a lot bouncier than Katsuki had been expecting. Considering the program that the website said she ran, he'd been expecting her to look a lot more intimidating. "What can I do for you, kid?" Katsuki's mouth went dry and the only thing that kept him from running out the door was the fact that he wasn't some shitty coward. "You're the fucker that runs the rehabilitation group for villains on probation, right?" Amplifier blinked a few times before she grinned. "That's me. We meet once a week and focus on rehabilitation and personal development. It's been really effective and we have a meeting starting in just a few minutes, but then you probably already know that, considering that you're here. Do you have a note from your probation officer?" "I'm not effing." Katsuki forced himself to calm down. "I'm not on probation. Your website said you could use a couple extra hands, so..." He took a deep breath. "I want to volunteer." Izuku blinked rapidly, half convinced that he was reading the words wrong. A 96% on the entrance exam? How was that even possible? There must have been some mistake, right? Izuku was too dumb to be able to ace the entire entrance exam when he hadn't even had time to do it twice. But there was Izuku's name at the top of the email, clear as day, and the letter had arrived in his inbox, so it must be for him. "Mom." He yelled so that she could hear him from the kitchen. Can you come here? I need to make sure I'm reading this right. Mom nearly slid down the hall in her hurry to open his bedroom door. What is it, Izuku? What's wrong? Izuku simply leaned back and pointed to the screen. He held his breath as Mom leaned over to read the email. He didn't know what he was even hoping for. He didn't want to get his hopes up, because there wasn't any way he'd passed, but if Mom read the same thing he did? Oh, Izuku! Mom turned to him with tears in her eyes that were at odds with the brilliant smile on her face. Congratulations! You got in. I knew you could do it. Izuku continued staring at the screen in shock as Mom sank to her knees and hugged him. I got in. I got in. Mom chuckled as he hugged him even tighter. You did. This is going to be so good for you, Izuku. I'll call Aldra first thing in the morning and do the paperwork. This calls for a celebration. Do you want to go out? Izuku shook his head and held up his cast. I don't want to risk running into anyone. Mom's eyes shone in understanding. How about some ice cream, then? I can go pick some up while you register for your classes. Izuku nodded and Mom smiled and ruffled his hair before she left. Izuku turned back to the email and clicked on the link to sign up for classes. The first step was to make sure he was registered for all the required classes, such as science, math, and literature. Then he had to take one foreign language class, so he ended up registering for English, since that was what the school recommended. The problem was that he also had to take 3 elective classes, but Izuku had never really had any hobbies outside of being a hero, which obviously wasn't going to happen. He frowned as he scrolled through his options. Art might be fine, it would help make his notebooks more detailed, if nothing else, so he added that class before he could start to doubt himself. But that still left 2 classes. He was most of the way down the list of electives by the time another class caught his eye. Quirk theory. That could be interesting. Analyzing quirks was one of his favorite parts of watching hero fights, and Eraserhead had mentioned that analyzing villains' quirks would help him fight better, so it wouldn't hurt to learn more about them. But that still left one final elective. He should probably choose something to do with a hobby, but Izuku really didn't have any hobbies outside of being a vigilante, and somehow he didn't think that his new school would let him count that as an elective. Thinking of his vigilantism made Izuku restless. It had been almost a week and a half since he'd gone out and he was really starting to miss it. His body had gotten used to waking up in the middle of the night, so he was spending a few hours every night just staring at the ceiling and reminding himself that Mom would never forgive him if he somehow managed to re-break his arm, and that if he did, then he'd have to explain how he'd broken it again, and that would just make her worry too much. His only consolation about the whole thing was that he knew that none of the heroes were missing him. In fact, they were probably just grateful that he was staying out of the way, and he knew he was being selfish for wanting to feel useful again, but that he just wished there was some way he could still help while he was healing. It would be amazing if he had a quirk that let him see the streets remotely, then he could just call the heroes and send them to where they were needed. It didn't even have to be a quirk. If he even had some sort of drone he could fly without being suspicious, or even just some sort of camera. Izuku sat straight up. Security cameras. Why hadn't he thought of that before? They were all over the city, and sure, they didn't cover every alleyway, but they had to be better than nothing. It was probably completely useless, since there was no way that a Deku like him would be able to become good enough at hacking to be able to access the city's security cameras without getting caught, but that well, he needed another elective anyway and programming would be a good skill for the future. He found a class on programming basics and signed up just as Mom arrived with the ice cream. He knew he shouldn't get his hopes up, it would only hurt that much more when everything went wrong again. Shoyuta was struggling to focus on his investigation. Really, he hadn't known Viridian for that long, so why should he be this affected by the fact that he disappeared? He just disappeared. Shoyuta didn't have any evidence to the contrary and it was completely illogical to assume the worst possible outcome. But he also didn't want to keep his hopes up, only for the kid to have been dead the whole time, just like? Well, he should be getting back to work. There had been more and more cases of instant villains the last few weeks, and the last time this had happened, it had been followed by the next level villains. It was almost as though whoever was behind the villain factory was gauging potential for villains the same way he did for heroes. which led to the next major mystery. Before his disappearance, Hamasaki had said something about the symbol of evil. The phrase tickled at the back of Shuta's brain, like he'd read it somewhere before, but hadn't paid any attention to it, but try as he might, he just couldn't remember the significance of the epitaph. It seemed to have some significance to Tsukuachi, but when Shoyuta had pressed him for answers, he'd simply said that it wasn't important. He'd said that it couldn't be the man he thought it was, because that one was already dead and had been for years. Shoyuta just hoped he was imagining the way that Tsukuachi had gone pale during the conversation. It was frustrating. The biggest lead they'd ever gotten about the villain factory, and it was a dead end. So what next? It just wasn't practical to put every single trigger user in protective custody in case the factory started abducting again, so they were on the back foot until the villains made another move. If only they knew what kinds of quirks appealed to the villain factory. Shoyuta knew that it wasn't necessarily strong quirks, because they had a lot of ways to strengthen them artificially, but there didn't seem to be any common denominator in the victims who got abducted and those that didn't. If only the kid were still dead, of course, even if he was alive, it wouldn't be fair to bring him into such a dangerous investigation. Even if he was a vigilante, he was still a semi-suicidal teenager who wasn't prepared to deal with the danger that came from investigations like this. But still, the kid had a talent for quirk analysis. He hadn't been able to spend a lot of time with the notebook, but from what he'd read, he had a sneaking suspicion that if anyone could figure out how the villain factory was picking their victims, it was Viridian. If Katsuki didn't know he was the best, he might be tempted to think he was an idiot. Seriously, how hadn't he noticed how messed up Aldra was? Were their teachers secretly villains or something? Because that was kinda the only explanation Katsuki could think of that would explain how they willfully ignored kids getting beat up right in front of them. And that wasn't even getting into the verbal bullying that happened right in the middle of class. The teachers didn't ignore that, but Katsuki thought ignoring it would be preferable to what they were doing. They seemed to be actively creating opportunities for the students to make fun of the less popular students, and often joined in the mockery by publicly shaming students for tiny offenses that wouldn't even get Katsuki a sideways glance. It was messed up. But what was even more messed up was that Katsuki didn't know how to stop it. He was supposed to be the best, but he wasn't about to pretend that he had any sort of moral authority here. He'd bullied Deku and all those other extras for years, so he couldn't just turn around and tell others to stop. Why had he even stopped? It had taken Deku literally saving his life to even get him to lay off the nerd, not that he'd ever forgive Deku for that, but still he'd effed up way too badly to say anything now. The best that he could do was stop acting like a villain. He'd thought it was pretty clever to volunteer at that villain rehabilitation group. Volunteering and sheet always looked good on hero school applications, and maybe he'd even be able to learn something or some sheet without jeopardizing his clean record. Not that he deserved a clean record, but that he needed to be a hero. He wasn't about to let his idiot teachers ruin his chances at being the #1 hero just because they couldn't be bothered to do their FING jobs. That amplifier beach had sent him home with some paperwork to do, but he'd be attending the next meeting. He'd just have to deal with being in the same room with villains without exploding them on sight. Katsuki glanced over at his teacher, who was correcting essays while fingers scratched at that one kid who could make bubbles. At least he was getting some practice. Deku wasn't coming back. That was what their shitty but villain of a teacher had announced at the beginning of homeroom. He said that Deku had decided to transfer schools, and Katsuki could only hope that was really what happened instead of it being a cover story, for if Izuku had really... Katsuki shook his head and forced himself to keep walking toward the community center. If Deku had killed himself, his old hag would have told him. Her and Auntie Inko had always been close, so if Deku was dead, he'd be one of the first to know. He had to be alive. Katsuki didn't know what he'd do if that Diamond nerd had really followed his messed up advice. The rehabilitation group met in one of the larger rooms of the community center. Amplifier was already setting up chairs in a big circle when he arrived. She looked up when she heard the door open and smiled as brightly as Deku did. Katsuki scowled. The last thing he needed today was more reminders of the Diamond nerd. "Hey Bakugo!" she yelled cheerfully. "Right on time. Can you finish setting up these chairs while I grab some water?" Katsuki didn't bother responding, figuring that the way he moved to grab a few of the chairs stacked against the wall was answer enough. Amplifier seemed to agree, given that she immediately left the room and let him do his thing. He didn't know exactly how many chairs to set up, but the group couldn't be that big, so after there were about 20 chairs out, he leaned against the wall and crossed his arms to wait. Amplifier came back a few minutes later carrying a large water jug that she set on the table next to him. "Alright, that's about it. Pretty low maintenance setup, don't you think?" Katsuki didn't really know what to say to that, so he just nodded. The villain extras were starting to filter in, so Amplifier left to go chat with them while Katsuki pretended to stare at the floor, even though he was really just observing the people he'd supposedly volunteered to help or something like that. He had a feeling Amplifier knew what he was doing, but he didn't really care what that beach thought. The people coming into the room didn't match what Katsuki had always been taught about villains, so that was just one more way his teachers had failed at their jobs, he guessed. Aside from the little tracking bracelets around their ankles, the villains looked relatively normal, nothing like the incarnations of evil that the news made them out to be. But maybe it was just because these were nobodies, not ranked villains. Or maybe they were just good at hiding who they really were, who knew? One of them, some guy with weird little tentacles instead of hair, caught his eye and smiled at him, but Katsuki simply scowled and turned away. He wasn't here to make friends with this scum, he was here to learn how not to be so scummy himself. Besides, villains weren't good people. They couldn't be nice, right? It only took a few minutes before everyone was there and most of the seats were filled. Amplifier smiled and skipped to the front of the room. "Hello everyone, welcome back." "Who's the kid?" Some big guy with horns and green skin said gruffly. Amplifier grinned. "Oh, this is Bakugo. He's gonna be helping me out for the next little while." There was a round of nods and welcomes from the villains, which Katsuki mostly ignored. "Why'd you decide to volunteer to help a bunch of villains?" A weird girl with pigtails asked loudly. Katsuki made a face that would normally send Deku running as he stared her down. "None of your effing business." There was a long moment of silence before the group erupted into laughter. The weird girl grinned. "Oh, I like him." "Yeah," the big-horned villain slapped his knee. "He's gonna fit in just fine." Katsuki stared at them like they'd gone crazy, then glanced at Amplifier, who was smiling at him like he'd done something great, which was what pushed him over the edge. "Shut up. I don't need your shitty approval." "Where'd you find this kid?" one of the other villains asked. "He's great." Amplifier's grin got bigger. "He came to me." "Don't worry, you're gonna have plenty of time to get to know him, but let's get started. Anybody want to share how their week went?" The cheerful mood dropped like a rock and the assorted villains became very busy looking at the floor. Katsuki frowned. If it was just one or two that had a bad week, he'd get it, but all of them? Had there been something specific that happened, or? The big-horned villain finally spoke up. "My girlfriend's family came to visit for the first time since we started dating. They're from a little town and I guess Hina didn't tell them about my quirk because they're the type of people that don't like mutant types. It's one thing getting called Frankenstein by little kids, they don't mean anything by it, they just think it's cool I've got green skin, but when adults say it, it's malicious. I managed to keep things civil until they left, but their stupid passive-aggressive comments really made me want to shoot someone." Amplifier nodded in understanding. "That must have been hard, facing discrimination from people who you were probably hoping would like you. I'm proud of you for holding out, though, and I hope things get better." "Fat chance," someone muttered. Katsuki frowned. Was discrimination really that big of an issue? "I'll go next." The tentacle-haired villain offered. "My mom was trying to get on my case about finding a job, even though I've told her there's no point. No one will hire me until I complete this rehabilitation course and get my arrest record wiped, but she doesn't seem to understand that. Normally, I just go out with friends and ignore her, but my old friends are part of why I'm in this mess in the first place, so—" "That's his man," Weird Pigtail said. "I'm kinda in the same boat. If I really want to become an upstanding citizen," her tone was met with a round of laughs, "I have to find entirely new friends. It doesn't seem worth it sometimes." Katsuki's frown deepened as the villains kept sharing their stories. If they weren't facing obstacles because of their villain status, it was because of their quirks or their gender. It was just so foreign to him. Was this what other people experienced? Katsuki hadn't ever had anyone judge him like that. Sometimes they thought it was weird that he was so angry, but as soon as they learned what his quirk was, they just wrote it off. It just seemed wrong that their experiences were so different. After everyone who wanted to had had a chance to share, Amplifier began talking about what the villain extras were supposed to be learning about this week. Today we're going to be learning to accept responsibility for our actions. There will always be circumstances beyond our control, but it's helpful to realize that not everything is someone else's fault. Yeah, Tentacles grinned, everything happens for a reason, and sometimes that reason is that you're an idiot. That drew a laugh from everyone, and even Katsuki found himself chuckling. Pretty much, Amplifier said cheerfully. But really, recognizing that sometimes things are your own fault goes hand in hand with realizing that you can become better. This isn't about beating yourself up, it's about realizing that if you broke it, you can fix it. Katsuki thought about that. His teachers definitely hadn't done him any favors in teaching him the right way to act, but they hadn't told him to beat Deku up. They hadn't done anything to stop it, but ultimately, it was his own decision to bully Deku and the other weak-butt extras. Katsuki swallowed the dot. Was it guilt? Was that what he was feeling? But Amplifier said he wasn't supposed to beat himself up, however tempting that seemed right then. So what now? He couldn't fix it. At least, he didn't feel like he could. He couldn't go back in time and be less of a JRK. He couldn't erase the fact that he'd told Deku to jump off a roof. None of that was ever going to go away, no matter how much he changed. Was there even a point to this, or was he just going to be a bully and a villain forever? Eventually, the class ended and everyone got up to get water and socialize before heading home. Katsuki was so lost in his own guilt that he almost didn't realize that the tentacle-haired guy had come to lean against the wall right next to him. Hey dude, I'm Eito Ogawa, nice to meet you. Katsuki simply scoffed and tried to ignore him, but the guy wouldn't take a hint. It's pretty cool how you're volunteering and stuff, Ogawa said. And I'm glad I'm not the new guy here anymore. Katsuki couldn't help wondering how a nice guy like this became a villain, when an asshole like him was on track to become a villain. Maybe he was just really petty and manipulative or something like that? If you've got something to ask, just ask it. Ogawa grinned. Don't be shy. I'm not effing shy. Katsuki growled. I was just wondering what the F you did you get arrested? You don't seem like the type. Ogawa chuckled. Thanks for the compliment, I think. He looked out at the room and sighed. My sister started running with the wrong crowd a few years ago, and I always thought her friends were so cool, so I started hanging out with people like them. Got arrested a few weeks ago for going on a rampage with a few others after we got dosed with an experimental version of Trigger. It wasn't our fault, so normally it wouldn't have put me on probation or anything, but, he grimaced, I happened to have an outstanding warrant for shoplifting when they took me in. Katsuki scoffed. Everything happens for a reason, huh? Ogawa smiled sheepishly. Yeah, and I'm an idiot. I'm just lucky this program exists, 'cause otherwise I'd be screwed. They'll really wipe your arrest record if you come to this? Katsuki asked. He nodded. I think it's supposed to be a way to limit the number of villains. If they try to rehabilitate those of us who aren't too far gone, then it frees up the heroes to go after the real bad guys, right? Katsuki shrugged. It made a certain type of sense. Well, Bakugo, it was nice meeting you, whatever your reasons are for being here. Ogawa smiled and waved as he pushed himself away from the wall. See you next week. Katsuki grunted and watched him leave. He had a lot to think about.